Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into one of the most profound mysteries carved into humanity's oldest clay tablets, a mystery that has captivated scholars, sparked endless speculation, and remains hidden in plain sight within the very cusp of recorded civilization. Before we begin this journey together, if you find value in these deep explorations into our ancient past, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something beautiful about knowing we're all scattered across this planet, from Tokyo to Sao Paulo, from London to Lagos, all gathered here in this moment to explore the same ancient enigma. Now I want you to get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, turn on a fan if you need that background ambience, grab your favorite late-night beverage. Because we're about to embark on something special, a journey that will take us from the glittering ziggurats of ancient Sumer through thousands of years of silence, mystery, and transformation that conventional archaeology struggles to fully explain. The title promises you the complete story of what Sumerian records reveal about the silent age that came after the Anunnaki, and I'm going to deliver on that promise. But here's what makes this topic so fascinating. The answer isn't what the internet's most vocal alternative historians claim. It's actually far more intriguing, more nuanced, and ultimately more profound than any science fiction narrative could capture. We're going to explore the actual Sumerian king list, one of the most remarkable documents from antiquity, and trace the mysterious transition it describes from an age of divine rulership to something entirely different. We'll examine the archaeological evidence for what really happened during this transitional period. We'll dive deep into the texts themselves, reading them for what they actually say rather than what modern popularizers want them to say. And yes, we're going to address the elephant in the room, the wild misinterpretations spread by figures like Zecharia Sitchin and others who have fundamentally misrepresented these ancient sources. But more than debunking, we're here to discover. Because when you strip away the sensationalism and actually examine the evidence, the tablets, the excavations, the scholarly translations, the archaeological layers, you find something far more compelling than ancient astronauts. You find humanity's first attempts to grapple with the transition from mythological time to historical time, from divine rulership to human kingship, from the cosmic order to the political order. You find what I call the Silent Age, a period of profound transformation that the Sumerians themselves recorded with remarkable honesty and complexity. So let's begin at the beginning. Let's start in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, where civilization itself was born, and trace the story forward through the ages until we reach that mysterious silence, and then discover what filled it. To understand the Silent Age that came after the Anunnaki, we first need to understand who the Anunnaki actually were in the original Sumerian conception. And this is where we immediately diverge from what you might have encountered on YouTube, in best-selling books, or in late-night documentaries on certain cable channels. Let's establish the geographical and historical context. We're talking about ancient Sumer, located in what is now southern Iraq, in the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is where, around 4500–4000 BCE, we see the emergence of the first cities: Eridu, Uruk, Lagesh, Nippur. These weren't just large settlements. They represented a fundamental transformation in human organization. For the first time, we see monumental architecture, specialized labor, writing systems, complex irrigation, and centralized religious institutions. The word Anunnaki itself comes from the Sumerian Anunna, which scholars translate as princely offspring or offspring of En. En, whose name means sky or heaven, was the supreme god in the Sumerian pantheon, the king of the gods. The Anunnaki, therefore, were understood as the children or descendants of En, essentially the divine council, the assembly of the gods. And this is crucial. In the Sumerian worldview, these were gods, not extraterrestrial biological entities, not aliens, not astronauts from another planet. They were the divine powers that governed the cosmos, nature, and human affairs. Now here's where it gets fascinating. The Sumerian understanding of the Anunnaki evolved over time. In the earliest texts we have, dating from around 2600 to 500 BCE, during what scholars call the early dynastic period, the Anunnaki appear as a collective group of deities, sometimes numbering 7, sometimes larger, who determined fates and passed judgments. The text corpus from this period, preserved in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature maintained by Oxford University, shows the Anunnaki functioning as a divine council that legitimized kingship, oversaw cosmic order, and maintained the fundamental structure of reality, what the Sumerians called me, pronounced me, the divine decrees or fundamental principles that governed everything from kingship to basket weaving. By the time we reach the Akkadian period, circa 2334 to 15 for BCE, and especially the Ur-III period, 2112 to 004 BCE, the concept had become more refined. The Anunnaki were increasingly associated with the underworld, while another group of gods called the Igigi became associated with heaven and earth. But this theological evolution is natural. Religions develop, concepts shift, synthesis occurs. What remains constant is that these were understood as divine beings, not physical entities who arrived in spacecraft. Let me be very specific here. The primary sources we're drawing from include the Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BCE, but drawing from earlier traditions, preserved in numerous copies including the famous Weld Blundell prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. This remarkable document lists all the kings of Sumer from the beginning of kingship, starting with the phrase after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The temple hymns and royal inscriptions from cities like Lagash, Ur, and Uruk, dating from 2600 to 000 BCE, which describe the relationship between gods and kings. The extensive mythological corpus, including texts like Enki and the World Order, the descent of Inanna, and Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada, which describe the Anunnaki's role in cosmic governance. The administrative tablets from temple complexes, which provide prosaic details about how the religious establishment actually functioned, ration lists, personnel rosters, offering schedules, giving us a window into how these theological concepts translated into daily practice. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Eanna precinct at Uruk, the Royal Cemetery at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s-30s, and the ziggurat at Ur, which provide the physical context for these religious practices. When we examine these sources carefully, what emerges is a sophisticated theological system in which the Anunnaki represented the divine establishment, the cosmic bureaucracy, if you will. They were the gods who maintained order, who had created humanity to serve them by working the land and tending the temples, and who governed through earthly representatives, the kings. And this brings us to the most important concept for understanding our topic tonight, the idea of divine kingship. In Sumerian ideology, kingship itself was divine. The institution descended from heaven. Kings ruled not by their own authority but as the appointed representatives of the gods. The Sumerian king list makes this explicit. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Notice that phrase, descended from heaven. Kingship was a divine gift, a cosmic principle, a me, that the gods bestowed upon humanity. The king was the earthly region of the gods, particularly of Enlil, the executive king of the gods, and later Marduk in Babylonian tradition. The king's legitimacy came from divine selection. Royal inscriptions invariably begin with formulas like Ur-Nammu, the mighty man, king of Ur, king of Sumer and Akkad, the man chosen by Nanna, the moon god. This theological framework is essential for understanding what comes next, the transition that I'm calling the Silent Age. Because the Sumerian records themselves describe a profound shift in the relationship between the divine and human realms, And that shift is precisely what we're going to explore. But before we move forward chronologically, we need to establish one more crucial element: the Sumerian conception of cosmic ages and deep time. The Sumerian king list doesn't just list historical kings. It describes an age before the flood when kings ruled for fantastically long periods, tens of thousands of years for individual rulers. Then it describes the flood, and afterward dynasties with more realistic, though still exaggerated, reign lengths that gradually decrease until we reach the historical period where the numbers align with other evidence. This is the Sumerian way of describing cosmic history, an age of origins when the boundaries between divine and mortal were fluid, when time itself operated differently, followed by a catastrophic rupture, the flood, followed by a transitional age, and finally the historical age when the records become verifiable through archaeology and cross-referencing with other sources. The Anunnaki in this framework were most active in that earliest age, the age before the flood, the age of divine rulership, the age when gods walked among humans. And our question tonight is, what happened after? What does the silent age after the Anunnaki actually refer to? What do the records themselves reveal? Let's find out. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. Because when we carefully examine the Sumerian king list alongside the archaeological evidence, we can actually trace the transition from mythological time to historical time with remarkable precision. And what we find isn't a sudden disappearance of the Anunnaki followed by a mysterious gap. Instead, we find a gradual, documented transition that the Sumerians themselves were aware of and recorded with surprising sophistication. Let's start with the Sumerian king list itself. The document, compiled during the Ur-III period around 2100 BCE by scribes likely working in Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, presents history in a linear fashion. One dynasty follows another, with kingship passing from city to city. But the structure reveals something profound about Sumerian historical consciousness. The king list begins with the antediluvian, pre-flood, period. 8 kings rule from 5 cities before the flood, with reign lengths that are astronomical. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alaujar ruled for 36,000 years. 2 kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. The text continues with increasingly long reigns, culminating with Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah figure, before statting. Then the flood swept over. Now modern scholars, including Thorkild Jacobsen, Samuel Noah Kramer, and more recently Pieter Michalowski, understand this section as mythological prehistory. These figures represent the primordial age when cosmic order was established. The numbers themselves may encode cosmological or numerological significance. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal system, base 60, which creates meaningful patterns in these numbers. But crucially, no archaeological evidence supports cities or rulers from this period with these names. Then comes the flood, the great disruption, the cosmic reset. And after the flood, something changes. The king list continues. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Notice that kingship descends from heaven again. It must be re-established after the catastrophe. The first post-flood dynasty is the first dynasty of Kish, and while the reign lengths are still exaggerated, hundreds or thousands of years, they're orders of magnitude shorter than before. And more importantly, as we progress through the dynasties, something remarkable happens. The reign lengths become increasingly realistic, and the kings begin to align with archaeological evidence. By the time we reach the first dynasty of Uruk, circa 2900 to 750 BCE, we have figures like Gilgamesh, who ruled for a claimed 126 years, still exaggerated, but moving toward human lifespans. And critically, Gilgamesh appears in other sources and likely represents a historical king, even if his legendary exploits in the Epic of Gilgamesh are mythologized. By the early dynastic III period, 2600 to 350 BCE, we reach fully historical territory. The kings listed have reign lengths measured in decades. Their names appear in contemporary inscriptions from their own reigns. Their palace and temple constructions can be excavated. We have administrative documents from their reigns. We've left mythological time and entered historical time. This is the Great Transition, what I'm calling the Silent Age, and it's not actually silent at all. It's the period during which the Sumerians themselves transitioned from understanding history through mythological frameworks to recording verifiable events. It's the age when divine kingship remained ideologically central, but actual kings were clearly mortal humans whose reigns could be measured and recorded. But let's go deeper. Let's look at what was happening theologically during this transition, because the Sumerian texts themselves describe it explicitly. During the early dynastic period, we see the emergence of a new literary genre, royal hymns and royal inscriptions that establish the king's legitimacy through divine selection, but also increasingly emphasize the king's personal achievements, military victories, building projects, and legal reforms. Take, for example, the inscriptions of Enatum of Lagash, circa 2450 BCE, whose famous Stele of the Vultures commemorates his victory over the neighboring city of Umma. The inscription begins by establishing divine legitimacy. Enlil, king of all the lands, father of all the gods, by his steadfast word, marked out the border between Ningirsu, patron god of Lagash, and Shara, patron god of Umma. But Ush, ruler of Umma, acted unspeakably. The text then describes Enatum as personally chosen by Ningirsu, receiving weapons from multiple gods and fighting under divine mandate. But significantly, Enatum himself does the fighting. The gods don't descend to battle. They empower their chosen human representative. This is a crucial shift from the earlier conception where divine beings directly governed. Similarly, the reforms of Urukagina of Lagash, circa 2380 BCE, represent the earliest known legal reforms in history. His inscriptions describe correcting abuses, protecting widows and orphans, and establishing justice. But he does this as a mortal king acting under divine mandate, not as a god himself or even as a semi-divine figure. Now, let's connect this to the archaeological record, because this is where we can verify the transition isn't just literary or theological, but reflected in material culture. The earliest Sumerian cities, particularly Eridu and Uruk, show clear evidence of being primarily religious centers. The archaeological layers at Eridu, excavated by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd in the 1940s-50s, reveal a continuous sequence of temple buildings stretching back to around 5000 BCE. The earliest structures are simple shrines, but they occupy the exact same sacred space that later became the massive temple complex of Enki. This represents thousands of years of continuous religious tradition. The literal foundation of Sumerian civilization is religious. At Uruk, the Eanna precinct and the Anu ziggurat complex dominate the city's earliest levels. Uruk period, 4310 BCE. The scale of these religious structures is staggering. They dwarf the residential areas. The famous White Temple at Uruk, dating to around 3200 BCE and sitting atop its ziggurat platform, represents a monumental investment of labor and resources. This is a society organized around religious institutions, with the temple as the center of economic, political, and social life. But by the early dynastic period, 2900 to 350 BCE, we see a shift. Palace complexes begin to appear that are architecturally distinct from temples. The Palace of Kish, excavated in the early 20th century, shows secular administrative architecture. The Royal Cemetery at circa 2600 to 450 BCE, excavated by Woolley, contains incredibly rich burials that demonstrate royal power expressed through material wealth and human sacrifice. The famous death pits, where dozens of attendants were buried with the primary occupant. What we're seeing archaeologically is the emergence of kingship as a distinct institution. The king is still ideologically connected to the divine. He mediates between gods and humans. He builds and maintains temples. He performs crucial rituals. But he's also clearly a human political leader with secular authority, military power, and economic control. This is reflected in the development of writing itself. The earliest cuneiform tablets from Uruk around 3200 BCE are almost exclusively administrative documents from temple complexes, ration lists, personnel rosters, accounts of offerings. Writing emerges to manage the temple economy. But by the early dynastic period, we have royal inscriptions, legal documents, international treaties, personal letters. Writing has expanded beyond religious administration to encompass the full range of human activity. The transition is also visible in artistic representations. In the earliest Sumerian art, divine figures are often indistinguishable from humans except by symbols, horned crowns, iconographic elements. But by the early dynastic period, we see clear differentiation. Gods wear distinctive horned crowns with multiple pairs of horns, the number indicating divine rank, while kings wear simpler crowns or caps. Gods are sometimes shown at a larger scale than humans, emphasizing the hierarchical distinction. Yet the relationship remains central. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin of Akkad, circa 2254–218 BCE, now in the Louvre, shows the king wearing a horned crown, claiming divine status for himself. This represents an Akkadian innovation, the deification of living kings. But significantly, even this occurs in a historical, verifiable context. We know Naram-Sin as a historical figure. We have administrative documents from his reign. We can trace his military campaigns through inscriptions. He's claiming divine status, but he's doing so as a mortal king ruling an actual empire. This brings us to a crucial text for understanding the theological dimensions of this transition: Enki and the World Order. This Sumerian myth, dating probably to the Ur-III period but drawing on older traditions, describes the god Enki organizing the cosmos after creation, assigning roles to various gods, and establishing the fundamental institutions of civilization. The text explicitly lists the divine decrees that govern reality, including kingship. Here's what's significant. The text describes the establishment of permanent divine order. The Anunnaki are present, playing their role as the divine council, but what's being established is a system where divine governance operates through institutional and natural order, not through direct divine intervention at every moment. The gods set up the system, the cosmos, the seasons, the hierarchy, the institutions, and then it runs according to those principles. This is exactly what we see reflected in the historical transition. The age of direct divine rule, the mythological prehistory, gives way to an age where divine order is maintained through human intermediaries, the kings operating within the cosmic system the gods established. The Anunnaki haven't disappeared. They remain theologically active, receiving offerings, answering prayers, determining fates, but they're no longer personally descending to rule cities. And this is the Silent Age. Not silent in the sense of no records, but silent in the sense that the direct, personal, daily presence of the divine rulers has transitioned to a mediated relationship. The gods are still there, still active in Sumerian theology, but operating through the natural and institutional order they established. Now, let's examine a specific case study that illuminates this transition: the city of Lagash and its extensive textual record from the early dynastic period. Lagash, located in southern Mesopotamia, has yielded thousands of administrative tablets and royal inscriptions from roughly 2500 to 350 BCE. These documents, studied extensively by scholars like Gerald Cooper, and now published in various volumes of the Mesopotamian Royal Inscriptions Project, provide an unprecedented window into how divine kingship actually functioned in practice. The rulers of Lagash, figures like Ur-Nanch, Enatum, Enanatum, and Urukagina, consistently present themselves as chosen by the gods, particularly by Ningirsu, the patron deity of Lagash. Their inscriptions begin with divine genealogies and divine elections, but the bulk of the texts describe decidedly human activities: irrigation projects, temple construction, military campaigns, legal reforms, trade agreements. One particularly revealing text is the inscription describing Urukagina's reforms. After establishing his divine mandate, the text describes specific social and economic abuses that had developed: temple administrators extracting excessive fees, officials confiscating property, the powerful exploiting the vulnerable. Urukagina's reforms address these abuses by establishing fixed fees, protecting private property, and defending the vulnerable. He concludes, he Urukagina freed the inhabitants of Lagash from usury, burdensome controls, hunger, theft, murder, and seizure of their property. He established freedom. This is remarkable. We have a human king, claiming divine authority, implementing social reforms to address very human problems of injustice and abuse. The divine realm provides legitimacy and moral authority, but the king himself must navigate complex social realities and implement practical solutions. This is the silent age in action, divine kingship without divine rulers physically present. The administrative tablets from Lagash are even more revealing. They record the daily operations of the temple palace complex, workers receiving rations, fields being allocated for cultivation, offerings presented to gods, materials distributed for construction projects. These are the mundane details of running an early urban civilization, and nowhere in these thousands of documents do we find evidence of divine beings directly managing these affairs. Instead, we see human administrators, priests, scribes, overseers, operating within a system understood to be divinely ordained but humanly implemented. Let's also examine the textual evidence for how the Sumerians themselves understood this transition. A crucial text here is the so-called Sumerian temple hymns, a collection of 42 hymns praising the temples of Sumer and Akkad, compiled around 2300 BCE but attributed to the priestess Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad. These hymns describe the temples, their patron deities, and their cosmic significance. What's fascinating is that the hymns describe the temples as the dwelling places of the gods. The gods are present in their temples through their cult statues, receiving offerings and responding to prayers. But the gods are present in a mediated way, through the cult, through ritual, through the sacred space of the temple. This is quite different from earlier conceptions of gods literally dwelling among humans in a direct, physical sense. The transition is also reflected in the development of mythological literature itself. The great Sumerian myths, texts like the descent of Inanna, Enki, and Ninmah, the flood story, describe events from the mythological past. They're explicitly stories about that time when, the primordial age when these things occurred. The very existence of these narratives as myths, rather than as contemporary reports, indicates an awareness that the mythological age has passed and the present age operates differently. Consider the Epic of Gilgamesh, which exists in both Sumerian and Akkadian versions. The story describes Gilgamesh, a historical king of Uruk from around 2700 BCE, on a quest for immortality. Crucially, Gilgamesh seeks to transcend his human mortality and achieve the divine status that beings like Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah, achieved. But he fails. The epic's message is clear. Humans, even great kings, are mortal. The age when humans could become divine has passed. This is the human condition in the post-mythological age. There's another dimension to this transition that we need to explore: the political fragmentation of Sumer and its theological implications. During the early dynastic period, Sumer was divided into numerous city-states, each with its own patron deity and royal dynasty. Lagash worshipped Ningirsu, worshipped Nana, the moon god, Uruk worshipped Inanna, Nippur was sacred to Enlil, Eridu to Enki. These cities frequently warred with each other over territory, water rights, and political supremacy. Theologically, this created complexity. If each king rules by divine mandate from his city's patron god, what happens when those cities war against each other? Are the gods fighting through their human representatives? This question led to sophisticated theological solutions, including the concept that Enlil, as king of the gods, granted kingship to one city at a time, so whichever city held supremacy at any given moment had the gods' favor. This is reflected in the structure of the Sumerian king list, which describes kingship moving from city to city. But this political reality also reinforced the Silent Age phenomenon. With multiple human kings claiming divine mandate, the relationship between divine and human rule became increasingly complex and mediated. Theological disputes had to be resolved through human political mechanisms, treaties, warfare, diplomatic marriages, rather than through direct divine intervention. The Akkadian Empire, 2334–15 for BCE, founded by Sargon of Akkad, represents the next major development. Sargon unified Mesopotamia under a single ruler for the first time, creating a territorial empire rather than a city-state. His inscriptions claim that the god Enlil granted him universal kingship. But significantly, Sargon is a new kind of king, not from an established dynasty, but a self-made man who seized power through military prowess and political skill. His grandson Naram-Sin went further, claiming divine status for himself and styling himself god of Akkad. This represents a dramatic shift. Rather than being appointed by the gods, the king himself becomes divine. But even this occurs within a recognizably human context. We have letters written by Naram-Sin dealing with administrative problems, military challenges, and political crises. Divine or not, he's functioning as a human ruler. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2154 BCE led to a period of fragmentation and chaos, followed by a Gutian interregnum that later Sumerian literature describes as a dark age. Then came the Sumerian Renaissance under the Ur-Iii dynasty, 2112–2004 BCE, when the city of Ur once again unified Mesopotamia under kings like Ur-Nammu and Shulgi. The Ur-Iii period is crucial for our topic because this is when many of our key sources were compiled or redacted, including the Sumerian king list itself. The scribes of Ur-Iii were looking back over Sumerian history, organizing and systematizing the traditions. And what they created was a comprehensive narrative of cosmic ages: the primordial age of divine rule, the catastrophic flood, the transitional age, and the historical age leading to the present. Ur-Iii kings like Shulgi claimed divine status and were worshipped in temples. But simultaneously, we have massive archives of administrative documents from the Ur-Iii state, the Drehim texts, the Girsu archive, tablets from Nippur and Ur, that show the empire operating as a complex bureaucracy managing resources, labor, and trade across a vast territory. The divine king presides over this system, but it's a human bureaucracy that makes it function. Now, let me address what's not in the Sumerian records, and this is crucial for understanding what the Silent Age actually represents. There is no textual evidence in any Sumerian source for a sudden departure of the gods, a catastrophic abandonment, or a mysterious disappearance of divine beings who had previously been physically present ruling cities. What we have instead is a gradual, documented transition from mythological frameworks to historical frameworks, from understanding kingship as literally divine to understanding it as divinely mandated but humanly executed. The Anunnaki don't leave Mesopotamian theology. They remain central throughout Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian religion for millennia. They continue to appear in myths, hymns, incantations, and prayers. but their role is consistently that of divine beings, gods, not aliens or ancient astronauts, who govern the cosmos from the divine realm and interact with humanity through mediated channels, temples, rituals, dreams, omens, and the institution of kingship. The Silent Age is not about the gods leaving. It's about humanity's transition from mythological consciousness to historical consciousness, from a worldview where cosmic origins and present reality are continuous to one, where past mythological time is distinguished from present historical time. And this transition is one of the most important developments in human civilization. It represents the emergence of historical thinking, of the ability to distinguish between myth and history, between legendary past and verifiable present. The Sumerians were the first people to make this distinction clearly, and they did so not by abandoning their religious worldview, but by integrating it with their growing historical consciousness. This is what makes the Sumerian achievement so remarkable and so often misunderstood. Now we need to address the elephant in the room, or more accurately, the supposed spaceship in the ancient sky. Because when most people today encounter the Anunnaki, they're not learning about actual Sumerian theology. They're encountering the wildly distorted interpretations of Zecharia Sitchin and the army of alternative historians who have followed in his wake. Sitchin, who died in 2010, published a series of books beginning with The 12th Planet in 1976, claiming that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a hypothetical planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth roughly 450,000 years ago to mine gold, genetically engineered humans to be their slave species, and ruled as the gods of ancient Mesopotamia before eventually departing, leaving humanity to fend for itself. This narrative has been enormously influential. It spawned countless books, documentaries, YouTube channels, and even major Hollywood films. And I need to be very clear. Virtually every specific claim Sitchin made about Sumerian texts is demonstrably false. His translations are wrong, his interpretations are wrong, his methodology is wrong, and his conclusions are wrong. Let me be specific, because this matters. Sitchin claimed to be a scholar of ancient languages, but professional Assyriologists, the actual scholars who study these languages and texts, have consistently pointed out that his translations of Sumerian and Akkadian are wildly inaccurate. Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar with a PhD in Hebrew Bible and ancient Semitic languages who studied under Akkadian specialists, wrote an extensive critique demonstrating Sitchin's linguistic errors. Dr. Irving Finkel of the British Museum, one of the world's leading Assyriologists, has dismissed Sitchin's work as pure fantasy. The scholarly consensus is unanimous. Sitchin's work is not legitimate scholarship. Let's examine some specific examples of how Sitchin distorted the text. First, the word Anunnaki itself. As I explained earlier, this term derives from Anunnaki, meaning princely offspring or offspring of in the sky god. It's a straightforward Sumerian compound word. Sitchin claimed it meant those who from heaven to earth came, which sounds impressive but is linguistically impossible. The Sumerian words for heaven, earth, and came are an, kai, and gen or du, respectively. Anunnaki doesn't contain these words in any form that would create Sitchin's translation. He simply made it up. Second, Sitchin claimed that Sumerian texts describe detailed space travel, rocket ships, and advanced technology. He pointed to objects in ancient art, stylized representations of gods, sacred trees, or ritual implements, and declared them to be spaceships, astronauts, and control panels. The most famous example is the so-called rocket in the stele of Ur-Nammu. This is actually a highly stylized representation of a ziggurat with a deity standing before it. The rocket is the temple tower itself, shown in symbolic rather than realistic style. Ancient Mesopotamian art frequently uses such conventions. They're well understood by art historians. Third, and most egregiously, Sitchin claimed that texts describe genetic engineering of humans by the Anunnaki to create a slave species. He cited myths like Enki and Ninmah, or the Atrahasis epic as evidence. Let's look at what these texts actually say. Enki and Ninmah is a Sumerian creation myth describing how humans were created. In the text, the gods are burdened with agricultural labor, digging irrigation canals, working the fields. They complain about the hardship. The wise god Enki, with the assistance of the mother goddess Ninmah, creates humans from clay to take over this labor, thus freeing the gods. Humans are explicitly created to do the work of the gods, to cultivate the land, maintain temples, and provide offerings. Now, Sitchin interpreted this as describing genetic engineering, claiming that clay was a metaphor for genetic material, and that the story described hybridization between aliens and primitive hominids. But nothing in the text supports this reading. The Akkadian word translated as clay is letter 1e6d imacron du, which means exactly what it says: clay, earth, mud. The Sumerian equivalent is im, also clay. The text describes a very specific process. The clay is mixed with the blood of a sacrificed god, providing divine essence. And from this mixture, humans are formed. This is a mythological description of creation, not a coded description of genetic engineering. Moreover, the idea that gods would need humans to work the land makes perfect sense within ancient Mesopotamian religion. The gods were understood to require sustenance from offerings and sacrifices. Temples had extensive agricultural estates that provided these offerings. The myth explains why humans exist and what their cosmic role is: to serve the gods through labor and worship. This is theology, not cryptohistory. The Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian creation and flood myth from the Old Babylonian period, circa 1800 BCE, tells a similar story in more detail. The gods create humans to relieve themselves of agricultural labor, but humans multiply rapidly and become noisy, disturbing the gods' rest. The gods decide to reduce the human population, first through plague, then drought, then finally the flood. The hero Atrahasis, equivalent to Ziusudra/Utnapishtim/Noah, is warned by Enki and survives in a boat. After the flood, the gods establish measures to control human population, including infant mortality, infertility for some women, and celibate priestesses. This is clearly mythological narrative addressing profound questions. Why do humans exist? Why is there suffering? Why do babies die? Why is there infertility? The myth provides theological answers to these existential questions. Reading it as a literal historical account of extraterrestrial genetic engineering requires ignoring everything we know about ancient mythological literature, religious thought, and literary conventions. Sitchin also claimed that the Sumerian texts describe a 12th planet called Nibiru on a 3,600-year elliptical orbit that periodically brings it close to Earth. He claimed this planet was the home of the Anunnaki. Again, this is based on fundamental mistranslations and fabrications. The Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish does mention a celestial body called Nibiru, but in context, it refers to Jupiter, which in Babylonian astronomy was associated with the god Marduk and called the crossing, which is what Nibiru means, a crossing point or ferry. Babylonian astronomical texts describe Nibiru as a star or planet associated with particular astronomical phenomena, but there's no mention of it being a massive planet on a long elliptical orbit, nor is it described as the home of the gods. The gods live in heaven Anu, or in specific temples on Earth. Furthermore, from an astronomical perspective, the planet Sitchin describes is physically impossible. A massive planet on a 3,600-year elliptical orbit passing through the inner solar system would gravitationally disrupt all the planet's orbits, making stable planetary orbits and life on Earth impossible. Astronomers have comprehensively debunked the Nibiru hypothesis. Now, let's address why Sitchin's interpretations are so appealing despite being false. There are several psychological and cultural factors at work. First, his narrative transforms ancient texts from religious literature, which modern secular readers may find quaint or irrelevant, into accounts of real historical events involving advanced technology. For readers who love science fiction but find ancient religion boring, this is irresistible. Suddenly, ancient texts become exciting, relevant, and scientific. Second, the narrative taps into a long tradition of alternative archaeology and ancient astronaut theories that date back to the 19th century, but gained massive popularity with Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods. In 1968, these theories appeal to people who are skeptical of mainstream academia, who enjoy feeling they have access to suppressed knowledge, and who find comfort in the idea that human achievements were guided or enabled by advanced beings. Third, Sitchin's narrative provides simple answers to complex questions. How did ancient people build massive structures? Aliens helped. How did civilization arise so rapidly? Aliens taught humans. Why are there similarities between different ancient cultures? Aliens visited them all. These explanations feel satisfying because they're simple, even though the actual answers, involving human ingenuity, cultural diffusion, parallel development, and the archaeological record, are more complex but also more fascinating. Fourth, there's a subtle form of racism underlying many ancient astronaut theories. The implicit assumption is that ancient people, particularly non-Western ancient people, couldn't possibly have achieved what they achieved without outside help. This denies agency, intelligence, and creativity to ancient humans. The reality is that the Sumerians were brilliant. They invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, sophisticated irrigation, urban planning, and complex administration through human ingenuity operating over generations. Let me also address some of the more recent inheritors of Sitchin's mantle, because the misinformation has evolved and multiplied. Various YouTube channels, documentaries, and books continue to promote ancient astronaut theories, often citing each other as sources in a circular reference chain that leads back to Sitchin's original mistranslations. Some have added new layers, claims about ancient nuclear warfare based on misinterpretations of vitrified stones and imaginative readings of texts like the Mahabharata, ancient power plants, misinterpreting the function of structures like the pyramids, and ancient energy technologies based on nothing. A particularly pernicious example is the misinterpretation of cylinder seals, small cylindrical stamps carved with images that were rolled across clay to create impressions. Ancient astronaut theorists point to images on these seals and claim they show spacecraft, astronauts in helmets, or astronomical diagrams of the solar system, including Nibiru. The most famous example is cylinder seal VA 243 from the Berlin Museum, which Sitchin claimed showed the solar system with 12 planets including Nibiru. Actual experts who have examined the seal identify the imagery as a star symbol with small dots around it, probably representing a star with its surrounding stellar field, or possibly the sun with planets, but in a highly stylized, symbolic representation that makes no claim to astronomical accuracy. The seal dates from the Akkadian period and shows a figure approaching a seated ruler, with the celestial symbol above. It's a royal or religious scene, not an astronomy lesson. Another frequent claim involves the so-called Sumerian astronaut images, relief carvings or figurines that supposedly show beings in spacesuits with helmets, backpacks, and breathing apparatus. These are invariably images of gods wearing their characteristic horned crowns, holding their traditional symbols like the ring endrad of divine authority, or priests wearing ceremonial costume. The helmets are crowns. The backpacks are wings or ritual objects attached to the figure. The breathing apparatus is ornamental jewelry. Once you've seen more than a handful of examples of Mesopotamian religious art, these identifications become obvious. The scholarly community has repeatedly debunked these claims, but they persist and spread, particularly on social media, where eye-catching images and sensational claims get shared without fact-checking. Now, I want to be fair and acknowledge that there are legitimate mysteries and open questions about ancient Mesopotamia. We don't fully understand how certain massive construction projects were accomplished with Bronze Age technology, though we have good hypotheses involving massive labor forces, sophisticated engineering, and techniques that left little archaeological trace. We don't fully understand how certain mathematical and astronomical knowledge developed so early, though we have cuneiform tablets demonstrating the step-by-step development of these sciences. We don't fully understand the precise relationships between different city-states and dynasties, though ongoing archaeological work continues to clarify the picture. These are genuine scholarly puzzles that archaeologists, linguists, and historians work to solve through careful research, excavation, and analysis. The solution isn't to invent fantastic explanations involving aliens, but to continue the painstaking work of scholarship. Let me also address a more subtle misunderstanding that's common even among people who reject Sitchin's extremes. Some people assume that the Sumerian king list's antediluvian period with fantastically long reigns must encode some kind of suppressed historical information, that there's a lost civilization or advanced pre-flood culture that the Sumerians were remembering. The scholarly understanding is more nuanced. The antediluvian section of the king list serves several functions. It establishes the divine origin of kingship. It connects the present dynasties to cosmic beginnings. It explains how the institution of kingship survived the Great Flood by divine reestablishment. And it places human history within a cosmic framework stretching back to creation. The fantastic reign lengths use the Sumerian sexagesimal number system to create numerologically significant patterns. They're not meant to be taken as actual chronological information in the way later historical entries are. This is similar to how the biblical genealogies in Genesis use stylized numbers and impossibly long lifespans for antediluvian figures. It's a literary convention that signals we're dealing with primordial, mythological time. Furthermore, there's no archaeological evidence for a massive civilization-ending flood in Mesopotamia that would correspond to the flood described in the texts. There is evidence of various local floods in different cities at different periods. Shuruppak, and other sites show flood layers in their excavated strata. But these are localized events at different times, not a universal catastrophe. The flood myth likely draws on the reality of recurring devastating floods in Mesopotamia, a land between two major rivers prone to flooding, but universalizes and mythologizes this experience into a cosmic story. The point is this: we can appreciate what the Sumerian texts actually are: sophisticated religious and mythological literature produced by one of humanity's first civilizations, without needing to reinterpret them as something they're not. The real Sumerians are far more interesting than Sitchin's aliens. Let me be very direct. If you're genuinely interested in what Sumerian texts say, don't rely on Sitchin, von Däniken, or the countless YouTubers who repeat their claims. Go to the actual translations made by actual scholars. The Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, ETCSL, maintained by the University of Oxford, has free English translations of hundreds of Sumerian texts. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, CDLI, provides images and transliterations of tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets. The Penn Museum, British Museum, and Louvre have extensive online collections of Mesopotamian artifacts with scholarly descriptions. Read these sources. Compare what they actually say to what alternative theorists claim they say. You'll quickly discover that the claims about ancient astronauts, genetic engineering, and space travel have no basis in the texts themselves. What you will discover is something far richer: the actual religious and philosophical thought of the world's first urban civilization, grappling with profound questions about human existence, divine order, justice, mortality, and meaning. The debunking is necessary, but it's not the end of the story. Because once we clear away the misinformation, we can appreciate what the Sumerian records actually reveal about the Silent Age, and that's where we turn next. So if the Sumerian records don't describe ancient astronauts departing and leaving humanity in a dark age, what do they actually reveal? What is the authentic significance of this transition I'm calling the Silent Age? The answer is profound. The Sumerian texts document humanity's first systematic attempt to reconcile mythological consciousness with emerging historical consciousness. They show us the birth of historical thinking itself. Let's unpack what this means. In the earliest phases of human culture, going back to the Paleolithic, humans understood time and causation through myth. Myths explain origins, how the world came to be, how humans were created, why things are the way they are. Myths establish meaning and place humans within a cosmic order. This mythological consciousness doesn't distinguish between past and present in the way historical consciousness does. The mythological past isn't back then in a purely chronological sense. It's the archetypal time, the time of origins, the sacred time that can be accessed through ritual. This is how humans thought for tens of thousands of years. It's how most pre-literate cultures think. The past is malleable, mythological, serving present needs rather than being objectively recorded. Something changed in Sumer. The development of writing, starting around 3200 BCE, created new possibilities. Initially, writing was purely administrative, recording transactions, accounts, inventories. But gradually, scribes began writing down the oral traditions, the myths, the hymns, the legends. And crucially, they began keeping dated records. Year names commemorating specific events, king lists tracking rulers in sequence, administrative documents dated to specific reigns. This created a tension. On one hand, the mythological tradition described kings reigning for thousands of years, a great flood, gods walking among humans, primordial times. On the other hand, the administrative and contemporary records described realistic reigns, human kings doing human things, events that could be dated and verified. The Sumerian response to this tension was brilliant. They maintained both frameworks simultaneously. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BCE, explicitly transitions from mythological time, antediluvian kings with impossible reign lengths, through a transitional period, early post-flood dynasties with exaggerated but decreasing reign lengths, to historical time, dynasties with realistic reigns that match other evidence. This is a sophisticated historiographical move. The scribes aren't rejecting the mythological tradition. That would be theologically unacceptable. But they're also not claiming that contemporary kings reign for thousands of years. That would be factually absurd. Instead, they create a framework where mythological time and historical time are both real but distinct. There was an age when time operated differently, when the divine and human were not clearly separated, when the cosmic order was still being established. That age ended, terminated by the flood. After the flood, there's a transition, and gradually we enter the age where time operates according to the rhythms we currently experience. This is the birth of historical consciousness, the recognition that the past was qualitatively different from the present, that there has been change and development over time, and that we can trace that change through records. And this is what the Silent Age actually represents. It's not that the gods departed or that something catastrophic happened that wasn't recorded. It's that human consciousness shifted. The age of direct, unmediated divine presence, always understood mythologically, not literally, gave way to an age of mediated relationship where the divine operates through natural law, institutional order, and human agency while remaining theologically present and active. Think about what this means for understanding the development of civilization. The Sumerians were the first people to develop writing and use it for both practical and literary purposes, build cities with populations in the tens of thousands, create complex state-level political organization, develop sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, record history in a systematic way. distinguish between mythological tradition and verifiable events, create bureaucratic administration with archives and record keeping. These developments are interconnected. You can't have complex administration without writing. You can't have historical records without archives. You can't have emerging historical consciousness without a way to compare past claims to present evidence. The transition from mythological to historical time isn't a rejection of the sacred. Sumerian religion remained central to their civilization for millennia. Rather, it's a refinement of understanding. The gods remain real and active, but the mechanism of their interaction with the world becomes understood differently. Consider how this plays out in later Mesopotamian thought. By the time we reach the Neo-Assyrian Empire 911–609 BCE, we have extensive archives of royal correspondence, including letters from scholars to kings reporting astronomical observations, omens, and their interpretations. These letters show sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena, eclipses, planetary movements, weather patterns, while still interpreting them as divine signs. This isn't primitive or irrational. It's a complex theological framework where the gods communicate through the natural order they created. The scholars study nature carefully, record observations precisely, and develop predictive models, all while understanding this study as reading the divine will express through creation. Similarly, the extensive legal traditions that developed in Mesopotamia, from Urukhadjina's reforms through the Code of Ur-Nammu, the Code of Hammurabi, and beyond, established justice as a divine principle, given by gods like Shamash, god of justice, that is implemented through human law and human courts. The divine mandate is real, but human agency and human wisdom are necessary to apply it. This is the mature form of what emerged during the Silent Age, a worldview that integrates divine sovereignty with human responsibility, cosmic order with historical contingency, mythological tradition with empirical observation. Now, let's consider the broader implications for understanding religious development. What happened in Sumer, this transition from mythological to historical consciousness, while maintaining religious worldview, happened independently in other ancient civilizations too. In Egypt, we see a similar pattern. Mythological prehistory, the time of the gods' rule on earth, gives way to historical dynasties, but the pharaoh remains divine and intermediates between cosmic order mad and human society. The Egyptian king lists, like the Sumerian ones, transition from mythological to historical frameworks. In early China, the Shang dynasty, circa 1600–1046 BCE, used divination through oracle bones, believing the divine realm Tian communicated through oracles. But simultaneously, they kept precise records. Oracle bone inscriptions are some of our earliest Chinese historical documents. The divine remains real and active, but is accessed through divination and interpreted by specialists. In ancient Israel, the biblical texts show a similar pattern. Genesis begins with mythological time, creation, primordial patriarchs with long lifespans, universal flood, then transitions through a legendary period, patriarchs, Exodus, to increasingly historical material, the monarchy period, where biblical accounts can be correlated with archaeological evidence and external sources like Assyrian records. This parallel development across cultures suggests something important. The transition from purely mythological consciousness to integrated mythological historical consciousness is a natural development when civilizations reach a certain level of complexity, develop writing, and begin systematic record keeping. The Sumerians were first because they developed urban civilization first, but the pattern they established, maintaining mythological tradition while developing historical record keeping, became the template for how literate civilizations understood their past. Let's also consider what this means for understanding the relationship between religion and science, faith and reason. Modern discourse often presents these as opposed or mutually exclusive, But the Mesopotamian example shows a more nuanced picture. The Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian tradition developed sophisticated astronomy, mathematics, and medicine while remaining thoroughly religious. Their astronomical observations were made in service of reading omens, but the observations themselves were empirical and precise. Their mathematical developments, including early forms of algebra and geometry, emerged from practical needs, surveying land, calculating areas and volumes, managing economic transactions, but were understood within a cosmic framework where number itself had divine significance. This isn't compartmentalization, sacred over here, secular over there. It's integration. The cosmos is divine, so studying the cosmos is a religious act. Understanding natural law is understanding how the gods structured creation. Human reason is a divine gift that allows us to participate in cosmic order. The Silent Age, then, isn't about loss. It's about maturation. The direct, immediate, unreflective mythological consciousness gives way to a more sophisticated understanding where the divine remains real and central, but operates through natural and institutional order that can be studied, understood, and participated in through human reason and agency. This has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between ancient and modern thought. We often imagine a sharp break. Ancient people were superstitious and irrational. Modern people are scientific and rational. But the reality is much more continuous. The same impulses that drove Mesopotamian scholars to observe the heavens, record phenomena, develop predictive models, and seek understanding drove later Greek, Islamic, and European scholars. The transition from mythological to scientific frameworks wasn't a rejection of the ancient worldview, but an evolution of it. In fact, many of the founders of modern science, Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, were deeply religious and understood their scientific work as studying the divine order of creation. The mechanistic, purely secular understanding of nature is actually a relatively recent development, mostly 19th-20th centuries, not the original form of scientific thinking. This reframes the Silent Age once more. It's not the end of divine involvement in the world, but the beginning of understanding how divine involvement operates through consistent natural order rather than arbitrary intervention. And this understanding made science possible. Let me bring this back to the specific Mesopotamian evidence. One of the most important sites for understanding the Silent Age is Nippur, the religious center of Sumer throughout its history. Nippur was sacred to Enlil, king of the gods, and was never a political capital. It was purely a religious center that all Sumerian and Babylonian kings honored regardless of where their political capital was located. Excavations at Nippur, conducted by numerous expeditions from the 1880s to the present, have yielded tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets spanning millennia. The site had a scribal school Edubba, where scribes were trained, and many of our literary texts come from this educational context. They're essentially textbooks and student exercises. What's fascinating is that the curriculum at Nippur, as reconstructed from these tablets, included lexical lists, long lists of words organized by category, a kind of ancient dictionary and thesaurus, mathematical problems and solutions, literary texts including myths, hymns, and epics, royal inscriptions and historical texts, legal documents and formularies, Sumerian grammar and syntax exercises. This is a comprehensive education covering language, mathematics, literature, history, and law. The scribes being trained here would go on to work in temple and palace administrations throughout Mesopotamia. They were the intellectuals, the administrators, the preservers of tradition. And what they preserved was precisely the integrated worldview I've been describing. Mythological tradition, the myths and hymns, historical record, the royal inscriptions and chronicles, technical knowledge, mathematics and administration, and legal wisdom, justice as divine principle implemented through human law. The Silent Age isn't silent at Nippur. It's eloquent. It speaks through thousands of tablets documenting the ongoing life of a civilization that had successfully integrated mythological consciousness with historical consciousness, divine order with human agency, sacred tradition with practical knowledge. This is the authentic legacy of Sumer. Not ancient astronauts, not suppressed technology, not catastrophic abandonment, but the foundational development of the integrated worldview that made civilization possible. Let's bring all these threads together and trace the complete story that the Sumerian records reveal about the age after the Anunnaki. The narrative begins in deepest antiquity, in the Ubaid period, circa 6500–3800 BCE, when the first settlements appeared in southern Mesopotamia. These were small villages, but they established the pattern, communities organized around shrines that would eventually become the great temples. At Eridu, archaeologists have traced an unbroken sequence of temple structures from around 5000 BCE forward, each one built on the ruins of the previous one, maintaining the sacred space across millennia. During the Uruk period, 4310 BCE, these settlements became cities. Uruk itself grew to perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, unprecedented in human history. Monumental temple complexes dominated the cityscape. Writing emerged, initially as a tool for managing the temple economy but quickly expanding. This is the foundation, urban civilization organized around religious institutions. The Sumerians looked back on this period as the time of beginnings, when the fundamental order was established. Their myths describe this as the time when the gods were most directly active, establishing cities, teaching civilized arts, organizing the cosmos. The Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian creation myth, describes kingship being lowered from heaven first to Eridu, the oldest city sacred to Enki. Then came the catastrophic flood, remembered across Mesopotamian tradition in multiple versions. The Sumerian flood story with Ziusudra, the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh, eventually influencing the biblical flood narrative. The historical reality behind this myth is debated, possibly a catastrophic flood at Shuruppak around 2900 BCE, or a synthesis of multiple flood traditions. But mythologically, the flood represents a cosmic rupture, an end of the primordial age. After the flood, the Sumerian king list says kingship descended from heaven again. It had to be re-established. And now we enter the transitional period, what I'm calling the Silent Age. This spans roughly from 2900 BCE, early dynastic I, through 2350 BCE, end of early dynastic III. During this period, as we've traced in detail, the character of kingship changes. The earliest post-flood dynasties in the king list have exaggerated reign lengths, but these progressively decrease. By early dynastic III, we have fully historical kings with verifiable reigns. The archaeological record shows increasingly elaborate palace architecture distinct from temples, showing kingship becoming institutionally separate from priesthood even while remaining religiously grounded. The textual record from this period, royal inscriptions, legal reforms, administrative documents, shows kings functioning as human rulers dealing with very human problems, warfare with neighbors, managing irrigation systems, building projects, social justice, international trade. Divine legitimacy remains crucial, but the mechanism has shifted. The king doesn't claim to be a god himself, that comes later in the Akkadian period, but rather to be chosen and empowered by the gods. The theological literature from this period, preserved in copies from the Ur-III period and later, describes the Anunnaki as the divine council that determines fates and maintains cosmic order. But significantly, they do this from the divine realm. They don't descend to personally rule cities. Instead, they operate through the cosmic and institutional order they established. This is the Silent Age. Not silent in terms of records. We have thousands of texts, but silent in terms of direct divine rule. The age of gods personally walking among humans and ruling cities has transitioned to an age where divine will operates through human intermediaries and institutional structures. The Akkadian Empire, 2334–15 for BCE, represents the next development. Sargon of Akkad unified Mesopotamia under a single ruler, creating a territorial empire. The ideology of kingship evolved. Kings now claimed more direct divine status. Naram-Sin declared himself god of Akkad and wore the horned crown reserved for deities. But even this occurs within a recognizably human historical context. We have letters, administrative documents, and royal inscriptions from these kings. They're historical figures whose reigns can be dated and verified. After the Akkadian Empire collapsed, the Ur-III dynasty, 2112–2004 BCE, reunified Mesopotamia. This is when many of our key sources were compiled, including the Sumerian king list. The scribes of Ur-III were looking back over centuries of history and organizing it into a coherent narrative. What they created was a framework that encompassed cosmic time, antediluvian period, transitional time, early post-flood dynasties, and historical time, verifiable kings leading to the present. This framework became the standard way of understanding history in Mesopotamia. Later king lists from Babylonian and Assyrian periods follow the same pattern. The distinction between mythological beginnings and historical time became institutionalized in how Mesopotamian civilization understood itself. Throughout the subsequent millennia, the Old Babylonian period, 2001–600 BCE, the Kassite period, 1601–155 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, 911–609 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, 626–539 BCE, and even into the Persian period, 539–331 BCE. This same theological framework persisted. The Anunnaki remained part of the divine pantheon. The gods remained real and active, but their mode of interaction with the world was understood through the framework established during the Silent Age, divine order expressed through natural law and human institutions. So what is the complete answer to our original question? What do the Sumerian records reveal about the Silent Age after the Anunnaki? They reveal a transition, the most important transition in human consciousness. They show humanity moving from purely mythological understanding of reality to a framework that integrates myth and history, divine sovereignty and human agency, cosmic order and empirical observation. The Anunnaki didn't leave. They were never physically present as the ancient astronaut theorists claim. They were always divine beings, gods, and they remained gods throughout Mesopotamian religion. But human understanding of how the divine relates to the human shifted. The direct, immediate, unreflective mythological consciousness of the earliest periods gave way to a more sophisticated understanding, where the divine operates through consistent patterns, the cycles of nature, the structure of society, the institutions of civilization. This transition made civilization possible in its fullest sense. It allowed for the development of law, divine justice applied through human courts, science, divine order studied through observation, history, divine plan traced through events, and philosophy, divine wisdom sought through reason. The Silent Age is silent only in comparison to the mythological age that preceded it, an age of direct divine rule that existed in mythological consciousness, but not in historical reality. What fills the silence is actually the noisy, complex, fascinating reality of human civilization. Kings and priests, merchants and farmers, scribes and craftsmen, all operating within a cosmic framework that remained profoundly religious, but had learned to distinguish between sacred time and historical time, mythological truth and empirical fact. This is the authentic story the Sumerian records tell, and it's far more interesting, far more profound, and far more important than any story about ancient astronauts. It's the story of how we became who we are, beings who can simultaneously honor mythological tradition and pursue empirical truth, who can maintain religious worldviews while developing science, who can see the cosmos as both divinely ordered and scientifically understandable. The Sumerians were the first to make this synthesis, and in doing so, they laid the foundations not just of their own civilization, but of all subsequent civilizations that built upon their achievements. When we read the Sumerian king list, we're not reading about aliens and spaceships. We're reading about the birth of historical consciousness itself, recorded by the first people who learned to distinguish between the mythological past and the historical present while honoring both. When we study the royal inscriptions from Lagash or Ur, we're not finding suppressed technology. We're finding the development of political institutions, legal reforms, and administrative complexity that made complex society possible. When we examine the temples at Eridu and Uruk, we're not seeing landing platforms for spacecraft. We're seeing the architectural expression of a profound religious vision that placed the divine at the center of human community and organized civilization around sacred spaces. And when we read the myths about the Anunnaki, we're not decoding messages about genetic engineering. We're encountering sophisticated theological thought about cosmic order, divine governance, human purpose, and the relationship between mortality and meaning. This is what the Silent Age reveals: not absence but presence, not catastrophe but transformation, not the end of divine involvement but the maturation of human understanding of how the divine and human relate. The Sumerians developed this understanding first because they developed urban civilization first. But the pattern they established, integrating mythological tradition with emerging historical consciousness, became the template for how all literate civilizations would grapple with the relationship between sacred tradition and empirical reality. This is their gift to us, not suppressed secrets about ancient astronauts, but the foundational framework for thinking historically, for balancing tradition and innovation, for maintaining religious worldviews while pursuing rational inquiry. The Silent Age speaks volumes. If we learn to listen to what it's actually saying rather than projecting our own fantasies onto the ancient texts. The quiet that settles over the later records does not arrive as an abrupt erasure. It enters more gradually, through absence rather than declaration. In the tablets that continue to be copied and recopied, the order remains, the columns are aligned, the sequence of authority is preserved. Yet certain names, once stable fixtures within these lists, begin to thin and then no longer appear where they once did. Early god lists, such as those arranged for temple instruction and cult maintenance, were not narrative compositions. They were tools. They ordered the divine landscape so that offerings could be assigned, festivals timed, and responsibilities distributed among priesthoods. In the earliest strata of these lists, collective groupings of deities appear with consistency. The Anunnaki are treated less as characters and more as a category, a classification embedded within the structure of the pantheon. Their placement suggests administrative familiarity rather than theological debate. As later copies of these lists emerge, the structure remains intact, but the grouping shifts. Individual gods rise in prominence, attached to cities, offices, and measurable functions. The collective designation that once gathered older powers together becomes less central, sometimes omitted entirely. The lists do not mark this as a correction or reform. They simply proceed as if a reorganization has already occurred. A similar pattern appears in the Sumerian king list. This text, compiled and preserved across centuries, presents kingship as something continuous, transferred rather than invented. Early sections describe authority as descending from a time beyond ordinary measure, with reigns that extend beyond realistic spans. These entries are not explained, they are recorded. The language treats them as inherited facts. Later recensions of the list shorten reigns, anchor rulers more firmly to specific cities, and standardize the presentation. Kingship remains divinely sanctioned, but the vocabulary becomes more restrained. References to assemblies of gods diminish. Authority is still said to come from the divine realm, but the source is less frequently named, less carefully enumerated. What is notable is not simply that certain names disappear, but that the function of the lists does not change. They continue to establish legitimacy. They continue to define order. The scribes copying these tablets do not annotate the absence. They do not restore the older groupings, nor do they comment on their removal. This suggests that, for them, nothing was missing. God lists such as the Widener compilation and later canonical arrangements like an equals annum show, increasing concern with equivalence and hierarchy rather than origin. Deities are aligned with one another across regions, their names adjusted to fit a standardized system. The emphasis shifts toward clarity and administration. Older collective terms become less useful in this context, less precise for a bureaucracy concerned with allocation rather than memory. In this process, the Anunnaki do not vanish through rejection. They recede through redundancy. The texts imply that their role no longer required explicit nomming for the system to function. Authority, once framed through broad ancestral groupings, is redistributed among specific offices, temples, and city gods whose responsibilities can be enumerated. The scribes responsible for these documents were not theologians in the modern sense. They were archivists of continuity. Their task was not to preserve every name, but to preserve order as it was understood in their present. If a name no longer served that order, its absence would not require justification. This raises the possibility that what appears as silence is not loss but transition. The knowledge embedded in earlier categories may persist in altered form, absorbed into structures that no longer require explicit reference to their source. The Anunnaki, once useful as a collective framework, may have become implicit rather than explicit, their authority diffused into the functioning of kingship and cult. The king lists reinforce this impression. As reigns become shorter and cities change more frequently, the text grows more concerned with sequence than with cosmic origin. Kings are measured against predecessors rather than against primordial assemblies. Legitimacy is still inherited, but it is inherited through lineage and city continuity rather than through named divine councils. No tablet announces this change as an ending. There is no closing formula, no declaration that an age has passed. The names simply cease to be necessary within the surviving administrative language. For the scribes, the world has not lost its foundation, it has reorganized it. Yet this textual quiet coincides with material layers in the cities themselves, levels of rebuilding, flood deposits, and architectural resets that suggest moments of disruption beneath the continuity of record-keeping. If the names stop appearing while the cities are physically restructured, does the silence reflect a shift in belief? Or does it mirror a landscape that has been covered over and rebuilt, leaving only certain forms visible to those who come after? The idea of covering over and rebuilding does not remain confined to the tablets. It is encountered again, more materially, when the ground itself is opened. In several Sumerian cities, the excavated earth presents a similar pattern: layers of occupation interrupted by bands of alluvium, silt deposited by water that once moved freely through streets and courtyards. These flood layers do not announce themselves as catastrophes in the written record. They sit quietly between walls. At Uruk, Kish, and Shurapak, archaeologists encountered these deposits at varying depths. The layers differ in thickness and composition, suggesting not a single event remembered across all cities, but repeated inundations shaped by local terrain. Above and below these layers, construction resumes with familiarity. Bricks return to established dimensions. Street alignments persist. Temples are rebuilt on their previous footprints, often with only subtle changes in orientation or scale. What is absent in these rebuilding phases is as striking as what remains. Foundation inscriptions that name divine patrons or invoke protective assemblies become less frequent immediately after the flood deposits, Where earlier builders sometimes marked thresholds or corners with dedicatory objects, later reconstructions often proceed without such signals. The buildings are not temporary. They are carefully planned, yet the language of dedication is reduced. The builders who laid these new bricks were not acting in ignorance of the past. They leveled debris, reused materials, and respected earlier boundaries. This suggests memory rather than rupture. The decision not to inscribe may reflect a change in administrative priorities rather than belief. The city needed to function. Grain needed to be stored. Labor needed to be organized. The walls needed to stand. In some locations, the flood layer seals beneath it objects that were never retrieved. Administrative tablets, still unbaked, were preserved by the silt. Above them, new tablets appear in the same script, recording the same transactions. The continuity of record-keeping contrasts with the physical interruption beneath. The flood did not erase bureaucracy. It compressed it. These layers also reveal moments of standardization. After rebuilding, brick sizes often become more uniform. Drainage systems are improved. Street surfaces are raised. These changes imply reflection rather than improvisation. The flood becomes an administrative problem to be managed, not a theological crisis to be narrated. The response is technical. In this context, silence may not indicate trauma but efficiency. The scribes who resumed work after the waters receded did not need to explain the interruption. Their records were concerned with the present distribution of goods, the reassignment of labor, the recalculation of fields whose boundaries had been altered by sediment. The flood is embedded in numbers rather than words. This pattern is especially evident in Shurapak, a city often associated with earlier flood traditions. Excavations revealed a substantial flood deposit beneath domestic structures, followed by a phase of rebuilding that shows no decline in complexity. Houses are reoccupied. Workshops resume. The administrative tablets from the subsequent levels show no break in procedural language. There is no register of loss, no inventory of what was destroyed. The system continues, as if adjusted rather than restarted. The absence of commentary suggests that floods were understood as part of the environment, recurring disruptions rather than singular events. Their management belonged to the domain of planning, not proclamation. In such a framework, silence is not forgetting. It is classification. The flood belongs to the ground, not the archive. Yet this raises a question about the earlier emphasis on divine assemblies and cosmic order. If floods once required theological framing, why do later reconstructions proceed without renewed invocation? It may be that the authority to rebuild no longer required reaffirmation from named powers. The process itself carried legitimacy, inherited through practice. The gap between flood layers thus becomes more than a physical interval. It marks a transition in how disruption is absorbed. The city remembers by rebuilding. The administration remembers by recalculating. The record does not pause to explain the absence of old forms of language. What emerges is a civilization that treats continuity as an operational matter. Knowledge is preserved in methods rather than declarations. The silence does not deny what came before. It renders it unnecessary to repeat. If floods could erase walls without erasing systems, and rebuilding could proceed without reasserting older divine frameworks, what happens to authority when it is no longer spoken aloud, but only enacted in routine records? If authority could persist without being named aloud, it would need a place to settle. After rebuilding had resumed and records once again filled the archives, that place appears to have been the tablet itself. In the levels above the flood deposits, clay documents re-emerge in great numbers, small and utilitarian, impressed quickly and stored without ceremony. They speak not of origins or protection, but of movement, measurement, and obligation. These tablets are administrative in the strictest sense. They record deliveries of barley, assignments of laborers, allocations of wool, and schedules of work. The format is consistent: quantities, names, dates, and locations. What is notable is not their content but their restraint. Earlier tablets of similar function sometimes begin with brief invocations or conclude with dedicatory phrases, acknowledging a temple or a deity under whose authority the transaction occurred. In many later examples, these references are absent. The omission does not suggest that temples ceased to matter. On the contrary, many of these records are clearly produced within temple complexes. The scribal hands are trained, the seal impressions official. The temple remains the administrative center, yet the tablet no longer speaks its authority explicitly. It assumes it. In cities such as Umma and Lagash, entire archives of such documents have been recovered. They are arranged by year, by official, by type of commodity. The scribes who produced them were concerned with balance and accountability. Their tablets are not addressed to the gods. They are addressed to the future, to those who will need to verify that grain was delivered and labor fulfilled. This change in tone suggests a shift in what required recording. Divine sanction, once useful as a visible framework, may have become implicit within the system. The procedure itself carried legitimacy. The act of writing, sealing, and filing the tablet was sufficient to authorize the transaction. The gods did not need to be named because their presence was presumed within the institution. Some tablets still reference temples, but as locations rather than divine actors. Grain is stored in a granary belonging to a god's house, but the god does not receive the grain. The transaction is between administrators. The divine name functions as an address, not an agent. The scribes appear to understand their role as custodians of continuity. Their concern is not explanation but accuracy. They do not describe why labor is owed, only that it is owed. They do not justify authority, only record its exercise. In this sense, the tablets are records of memory in motion, carrying forward a system that no longer needs to articulate its foundations. The seals impressed upon these tablets reinforce this impression. Many show figures and symbols whose meanings are standardized. They identify offices, not narratives. The seal verifies the tablet, not a cosmic order. The authority it represents is administrative, inherited through position rather than invoked through myth. This does not imply disbelief or abandonment of older frameworks. Rather, it suggests a narrowing of what belongs in the archive. The tablets are not silent because belief has faded, but because belief no longer requires inscription at this level. The system has learned to operate on precedent. In such an environment, the absence of divine attribution becomes a form of efficiency. The scribes are not erasing memory. They are conserving it by embedding it in routine. The past is preserved through repetition, not recollection. Yet this raises a quiet uncertainty. If the tablets no longer name the powers under which they function, and authority is carried forward through procedure alone, how long can memory persist without articulation before it becomes indistinguishable from habit? If memory can persist as habit, then authority may do the same. In the inscriptions left by rulers after the floods, power appears less as a gift received from above and more as a condition maintained on the ground. The language of kingship continues, but its orientation shifts. What had once looked upward now settles into place. In earlier periods, rulers often framed themselves through proximity to the divine realm. Their names were sometimes embedded in genealogies that reached beyond the human line, or paired with phrases that emphasize selection by specific gods or assemblies. After the rebuilding phases, a quieter tone emerges. Kings continue to commission inscriptions, but the claims they make are narrower, more procedural. Stone plaques, foundation nails, and clay cones from cities such as Lagash and Adab show rulers identifying themselves by office and city rather than by descent. A man is named as Lugal or Ensi, followed by the city he governs. He records that he built a wall, restored a canal, or repaired a temple. The divine name may appear as the owner of the structure, but the king does not present himself as originating from the divine sphere. He is an administrator acting within an inherited framework. This change does not suggest humility in the modern sense. It suggests a different understanding of legitimacy. Authority is treated as something held in trust rather than something bestowed anew. The king's task is to maintain what exists, to keep the city functioning according to established order. His inscription records compliance with that order rather than elevation above it. Year names reinforce this impression. Earlier rulers sometimes named years after divine acts or extraordinary events. Later, year names increasingly reference practical achievements, the digging of a canal, the construction of a gate, the installation of a standard. These markers anchor time to civic labor rather than to cosmic intervention. The calendar becomes a ledger of maintenance. The absence of divine descent language does not imply a denial of divine involvement. Temples continue to receive attention, and gods continue to be acknowledged as patrons of cities. What changes is the king's relationship to them. He no longer stands as an intermediary whose authority flows directly from the sky. Instead, he appears as a steward whose legitimacy is demonstrated through visible care for inherited structures. This is especially evident in boundary inscriptions and treaties. When rulers define borders or settle disputes, they appeal to precedent and agreement rather than to divine ancestry. The gods may witness the arrangement, but they do not generate it. The authority to decide rests with offices and assemblies that operate within remembered tradition. Scribes recording these texts do not explain the shift. They write as if this form of kingship requires no justification. The formulae are stable. The change lies in what is omitted. The sky is no longer claimed because it no longer needs to be claimed. Authority has found its footing in continuity. The Anunnaki, once associated with the distribution of destinies and the establishment of order, are not invoked in these royal statements. Their absence does not appear polemical. It is administrative. The king governs through inherited procedures that no longer require reference to the original distributors of authority. Their role may have been absorbed into the concept of kingship itself. This absorption suggests a form of institutional memory. The origin of authority is preserved in structure rather than speech. Kings act as if the system they serve has always existed in its present form. The silence about earlier frameworks does not erase them. It renders them foundational and therefore invisible. Yet the king's inscriptions still reach outward in one direction. They are often embedded in buildings, placed beneath walls or within thresholds. Their audience is not the divine assembly but the future builder who will uncover them. The message is simple. This place was maintained. If kings no longer needed to claim the sky to govern effectively, and authority could be exercised through routine restoration, then where did the memory of earlier orders reside? Did it remain in the buildings themselves, waiting to be encountered by those who rebuilt them? If authority could settle into stone and brick, then the places built to house it would carry memory longer than names. In the cities where kings no longer claimed descent from the sky, temples continued to rise on the same ground, aligned to the same axes, their platforms rebuilt layer by layer. The continuity is architectural before it is textual. At sites such as Uruk, Nippur, and Eridu, excavations reveal temples rebuilt repeatedly atop earlier foundations. The lowest levels are often difficult to access, compressed beneath centuries of construction, yet their outlines guide what comes after. Walls are thickened rather than replaced. Courtyards retain their proportions. Even when materials change, the plan persists. Builders appear to treat the ground itself as authoritative. The dedicatory inscriptions associated with these rebuilding phases show a gradual change in emphasis. Early inscriptions sometimes record elaborate relationships between the temple and a broad divine order. Later texts grow more specific. A temple is rebuilt for a named deity of a city, identified by title and function rather than by place within a larger assembly. The language becomes local. This shift does not suggest that ritual ceased or diminished. On the contrary, offering installations, altars, and storage rooms remain prominent. The daily rhythms of temple life continue. What changes is how that life is explained. The inscriptions no longer situate the temple within a cosmic hierarchy. They situate it within civic maintenance. Builders describe their work as restoration rather than creation. They often use verbs that imply return to a proper state, as if the temple's ideal form already exists and must simply be recovered. The memory of that form appears to reside in the ground plan itself, transmitted through practice rather than description. In some cases, the divine name attached to a temple shifts while the structure remains largely unchanged. A sanctuary originally associated with one aspect of a deity may later be dedicated to another, or absorbed into a different cultic identity. The space continues to function as a place of offering and administration, even as its inscriptional identity evolves. Ritual persists, but its narrative framing adapts. The scribes recording these dedications do not comment on the change. They write as if the continuity of the building guarantees the continuity of its purpose. The name is treated as adjustable, the structure as fixed. This suggests that ritual knowledge was embedded in spatial practice rather than textual explanation. Such temples also functioned as archives. Within their walls, tablets were stored, copied, and referenced. The temple was not only a place of offering but a repository of records. As dedicatory language became more concise, the administrative role of the temple grew more visible. The building itself mediated between memory and function. The Anunnaki, once associated with the ordering of temples and destinies, are not named in these later dedications. Their absence does not disrupt the ritual cycle. Offerings continue. Festivals are observed. The system operates without explicit reference to its earlier framework. This suggests that whatever authority once required collective divine naming has been absorbed into the institution of the temple itself. Builders working on these sites appear to understand their task as one of alignment rather than innovation. They align new walls with old ones, new names with existing spaces. The temple becomes a vessel whose contents can be adjusted while its form endures. Memory is preserved through use. This raises a subtle tension. If ritual continues without the original language that once explained it, then understanding may gradually separate from practice. The act remains, but its context narrows. The temple continues, but its story becomes quieter. When names change but foundations do not, and ritual proceeds without recalling its earliest explanations, does meaning reside more securely in words or in the spaces that outlast them? If meaning could reside in spaces long after names had shifted, then language itself would eventually adjust to match that economy. In the tablets produced during the periods of temple rebuilding and administrative consolidation, the Sumerian language grows increasingly restrained. The change is not abrupt. It unfolds through usage, through what scribes choose to record and how they choose to record it. Earlier compositions demonstrate a broad expressive range. Verbal forms are extended, clauses layered, metaphors sustained across lines. Even when addressing practical matters, the language sometimes gestures outward, situating an action within a wider order. In later tablets, particularly those associated with administration, this range contracts. The grammar tightens. Sentences become sequences. Verbs are reduced to function. The shift is most visible in the predominance of formulae. A tablet begins with a date, followed by a transaction, followed by a confirmation. The same structures recur with minimal variation. Words that once carried descriptive weight now serve as markers. A sign that once denoted a quality becomes a unit. A phrase that once implied intention now marks completion. Scribes trained in this environment appear to understand writing as a tool of stability. Their task is not to elaborate meaning but to fix it. The language they use is precise, but it is precise in a narrow way. It measures, it counts, it assigns. It does not explain. This does not imply a loss of linguistic capability. Literary texts continue to be copied in scribal schools. Hymns, proverbs, and instructional compositions survive. Yet these genres increasingly occupy separate spaces within the archive. The tablets that circulate through daily administration rarely intersect with them. The language of governance becomes its own register. In this register, ambiguity is minimized. Signs are selected for clarity rather than resonance. The same phrase is used across cities and decades, even when local speech might differ. This standardization suggests a shared understanding of what writing is meant to accomplish. It preserves continuity across time by limiting interpretation. The narrowing of recorded language also reflects a narrowing of recorded concern. The tablets track obligations fulfilled and resources transferred. They do not record why systems exist, only that they operate. Memory is maintained through repetition of form rather than through narrative recall. This has implications for how earlier frameworks persist. If divine assemblies and cosmic distributions once required elaborate description, their absence from administrative language suggests that they no longer needed linguistic reinforcement. The system they established continues to function without restatement. The memory of origin becomes embedded in procedure. Scribes copying older literary texts do so with care, but often without commentary. They preserve words whose contexts may no longer be actively referenced in administrative life. The act of copying becomes an act of preservation rather than engagement. Meaning is kept intact by being left untouched. In this environment, language serves two parallel functions. In one, it maintains daily order through formula. In the other, it archives inherited knowledge without integrating it into current practice. The gap between these functions widens quietly. The Anunnaki, whose names appear frequently in earlier narrative and explanatory texts, are rarely required within the administrative register. Their absence does not signal rejection. It reflects the limits of what needs to be said for the system to continue. Language has adapted to what is necessary. As writing becomes increasingly procedural, it also becomes increasingly temporal. Dates matter. Sequences matter. The past is present only insofar as it establishes precedent. The future is anticipated only insofar as records will be checked. The broader frame recedes. This suggests that memory has been redistributed. It no longer resides primarily in extended linguistic expression, but in the reliability of forms. Civilization remembers by repeating its sentences exactly, not by elaborating on their meaning. If language can preserve order while allowing explanation to fade, then where does interpretation migrate when words are reduced to function? Does it shift into other forms of knowledge that remain unspoken but precisely maintained? If interpretation could migrate away from words and into forms that no longer required explanation, then some kinds of knowledge would persist almost unchanged, even as their stories fell silent. In the tablets concerned with the sky, this movement becomes visible. The heavens continue to be observed, named, and ordered, but the language that once framed them within a larger narrative gradually withdraws. Star lists from later periods present the night sky as an inventory. Constellations are arranged in sequences tied to months and seasons. Their names are recorded with care, often accompanied by numerical associations or directional markers. What is absent is commentary. The tablets do not explain why a star carries a particular name or what role it once played within a cosmic order. They assume recognition. Calendrical texts reinforce this impression. Months are defined by predictable astronomical events, the heliacal rising of a star, the lengthening or shortening of daylight, the recurrence of a seasonal wind. These markers are treated as reliable instruments for organizing labor, festivals, and taxation. The sky is used as a clock rather than a canvas for meaning. Earlier compositions sometimes link celestial bodies to divine agencies, assigning them roles within a broader structure of authority. In later star lists, the same bodies appear without such associations. The stars remain fixed points of reference, but their explanatory context is no longer required for their function. The knowledge has become technical. The scribes responsible for these texts demonstrate precision. Numerical regularity is preserved. Observations are consistent across copies. Errors are corrected. This suggests that astronomical knowledge was actively maintained, not passively inherited. Yet its maintenance does not rely on narrative reinforcement. Accuracy replaces explanation. In some tablets, constellations are grouped according to their rising times or paths across the sky. The groupings are systematic. They reflect long-term observation rather than symbolic association. The sky is partitioned for use, not interpretation. The scribes appear to understand their task as preserving a working model of celestial behavior. This approach implies confidence in inherited frameworks. The observers do not need to restate why the stars matter. Their importance is demonstrated daily through their utility. Agricultural cycles, temple schedules, and civic obligations depend on correct timing. The stars fulfill their roles silently. The Anunnaki, once connected in earlier texts to the ordering of heaven and earth, are not invoked in these astronomical records. Their absence does not diminish the authority of the observations. The sky continues to regulate life without requiring acknowledgement of its earlier custodians. Whatever origin stories once accompanied this knowledge are no longer necessary for its operation. The tablets also reveal an awareness of correction over time. Some star lists note adjustments, shifts in timing that require recalibration. This suggests that the scribes understood the sky as stable but not static. Their concern is continuity through accuracy rather than fidelity to an original description. In this way, astronomical knowledge becomes a form of memory that does not speak. It remembers through alignment, through repeated verification. The sky itself becomes the archive, and the tablets its index. Meaning is present, but it is embedded in use rather than expressed in language. This narrowing of expression mirrors changes elsewhere in the record. As language becomes administrative, so does observation. The heavens are integrated into the same procedural world as grain accounts and labor schedules. They are part of the system, not above it. Yet the precision preserved in these texts hints at an earlier depth. The consistency of names across centuries suggests a long lineage of observation and classification. The fact that the names endure even when their stories do not implies that knowledge can outlive its explanations. If the sky could be reduced to a set of reliable measures without losing its authority, and if its order could be preserved without recalling how that order was first understood, then when precision itself becomes the inheritance, what happens to the reasoning that once taught people how to count it? If precision itself could become an inheritance, then numbers would be among its most durable carriers. After the sky had been reduced to reliable intervals and the stars to fixed markers, the tablets concerned with calculation reveal a similar endurance. Numerical systems persist with little alteration, even as the language around them grows spare. From the earliest levels onward, Sumerian scribes employ a structured approach to quantity. Sexagesimal place values, fractional divisions, and standardized measures appear repeatedly in tablets separated by centuries. What is striking in later archives is not the introduction of new techniques, but the careful maintenance of existing ones. The numbers behave as if they have always been there. Mathematical tablets from temple and palace contexts record conversions, area calculations, and capacity measurements. Fields are assessed, canals measured, rations distributed. The procedures are consistent. A scribe trained generations after the earliest examples applies the same ratios and tables without commentary. The method does not require explanation because it is already known. Some tablets preserve lists of reciprocal numbers and multiplication tables. These are instructional documents, likely used in scribal training. They present relationships between numbers without narrative framing. There is no attempt to justify why these relationships hold. They are treated as given, as properties of the system itself. This suggests that mathematical knowledge was transmitted as practice rather than as theory. The scribes learned by copying, by repetition, by applying established forms. The origin of these forms is not addressed. Their authority lies in their reliability. The persistence of measurement systems reinforces this impression. Units of length, area, and volume remain stable across administrative changes. Even when political control shifts or cities rise and fall, the measures continue. A field is still assessed in the same way. A volume of grain is still defined by the same container. The system does not adapt to rulers. Rulers adapt to the system. This stability implies that mathematics functioned as a shared infrastructure. It was not owned by any one institution or lineage. It belonged to the practice of administration itself. The memory of how to count and measure was embedded in daily operations. The Anunnaki, once associated in earlier texts with the ordering of destinies and measures, are not present in these numerical records. Their absence does not disrupt the system. Calculation proceeds without invoking its original arbiters. The numbers retain their authority independently. Errors, when they appear, are corrected within the system. A miscalculated area is adjusted by reference to the standard table. The correction does not appeal to tradition or divine sanction. It appeals to the established relationship between numbers. This suggests confidence in the internal coherence of the system. Some tablets show signs of being copied long after their practical use may have faded. Old problem sets are reproduced faithfully, even when their immediate application is unclear. This copying preserves technique beyond necessity. It suggests an understanding that the knowledge itself must be maintained, regardless of whether its origin is remembered. In this way, mathematics becomes a form of silent continuity. It carries forward a way of thinking that does not require explanation to function. The founders of the system do not need to be named for the system to persist. Their contribution is present in every calculation, but unspoken. The scribes who handled these tablets appear to understand their role as caretakers rather than innovators. Their task is to apply what has been handed down correctly. Innovation, when it occurs, is subtle and framed as adjustment rather than departure. The core remains intact. This raises a quiet uncertainty. If numerical techniques can outlive the memory of those who first established them, and if calculation can continue without recalling why its rules were set as they are, then when numbers govern land, labor, and obligation, who ultimately defines what is considered just measure? If numbers could define fairness without recalling their makers, then rules might do the same. In the legal tablets that survive from later periods, authority is articulated with increasing restraint. Law continues to be written, copied, and enforced, but the language that once tied judgment explicitly to divine will become less prominent. The earliest law collections attributed to rulers such as Ur-Nammu and Lipitishtir still acknowledge divine sanction, but even within these texts, the structure of the laws themselves is procedural. Each clause defines a condition and a consequence. Injury is measured. Compensation is assigned. Responsibility is clarified. The gods appear at the beginning, establishing legitimacy, but they do not intervene in the judgments that follow. As later copies and related legal documents appear, the framing grows quieter. Contracts, court records, and verdicts often omit divine invocation entirely. They record disputes over land, labor, marriage, and debt with careful attention to precedent and testimony. The authority of the judgment rests on witnesses, seals, and written agreement rather than on appeal to the divine realm. This shift suggests a confidence in inherited legal structure. The system does not require repeated justification. Its legitimacy is assumed through continuity of use. The scribes who record these decisions treat law as an established instrument, not as a revelation renewed each time it is applied. In court tablets from cities such as Nippur and Sippar, the procedure is consistent. Parties present claims, witnesses attest, officials render decisions. The language is precise and limited. There is little room for explanation beyond what is necessary to establish facts. The gods are not asked to decide, the process does so. This does not imply that divine concepts vanish from society. Oaths are still sworn. Temples still function as places of record and arbitration. Yet the law itself operates with a degree of independence. It draws authority from its own structure, inherited from earlier frameworks that no longer need to be named. The Anunnaki, associated in earlier traditions with the establishment of order and destiny, are absent from these legal formulations. Their silence mirrors their absence elsewhere in the administrative record. The rules they were once thought to oversee appear to have been absorbed into human institutions. Legal language also reflects an emphasis on restoration rather than punishment. Many laws focus on compensation, on returning balance rather than exacting retribution. This approach aligns with a worldview in which order is maintained through correction, not disruption. The law serves to repair the social fabric, not to dramatize authority. The scribes who copied these laws appear to understand them as practical tools. Tablets are organized, referenced, and sometimes recopied alongside administrative records. Law is part of the same archival system as grain accounts and labor rosters. It belongs to memory as practice. Over time, the distinction between sacred and civic justification narrows. Law becomes a matter of record rather than proclamation. Its power lies in being written, sealed, and remembered. The absence of divine invocation does not weaken it, it clarifies its function. This evolution suggests that governance has inherited a sacred framework without continuously displaying it. The structure remains, even as its language becomes minimal. Authority is preserved through repetition and adherence rather than through appeal. If law can continue to regulate life without calling upon the gods who once framed it, and if justice can be administered through inherited procedure alone, then when disputes arise that touch the body rather than property, will the same quiet authority be sufficient to address them? If law could function without calling upon the gods, then it is perhaps unsurprising that medicine, too, begins to operate in a more procedural register. In the archives of the later Sumerian cities, tablets record treatments, preparations, and observations with a precision that often omits the invocations and ritual formulas so prominent in earlier compositions. The focus shifts toward technique and repetition rather than divine sanction. The medical tablets from Nippur, Lagash, and Umma reveal extensive lists of remedies, instructions for applying poultices, and sequences for preparing decoctions. Measurements are given carefully: the weight of roots, the quantity of water, the duration of boiling. The language is concise and practical. Steps follow one another in a clear order, as if the procedure itself embodies its own authority. Where earlier texts might begin by invoking the name of a deity to protect, heal, or observe, many of these later tablets record only the materials and methods. A treatment for a fever, for instance, specifies precisely which herbs to combine, in what proportions, and how to administer them. The success of the remedy is implied to reside in proper execution rather than in spiritual favor. These records also demonstrate awareness of classification. Diseases and symptoms are described with a degree of specificity that allows scribes and practitioners to identify them systematically. A tablet might note the type of swelling, the color of a rash, or the timing of a cough. Remedies are paired accordingly. Observation guides action rather than narrative explanation. This procedural approach does not imply that divine belief vanished from daily life. Temples remained centers of learning and storage for medical knowledge, and many practitioners continued to offer prayers alongside treatment. Yet the surviving textual record emphasizes the techniques themselves, preserving instructions for practical application. Knowledge continues, even when the spiritual framework recedes from the text. The scribes copying these tablets treat each formula as a unit of memory. Instructions are repeated faithfully, sometimes over generations, ensuring that the method is maintained even if its original author is forgotten. The tablets themselves become repositories of practice, carrying accumulated experience forward in a form that does not require constant reinterpretation. Some tablets also indicate experimental awareness. Measurements are adjusted, sequences are refined, observations are noted. The language remains economical, but the underlying concern is accuracy and reproducibility. In this way, the records preserve not only the remedies but a methodology, a disciplined approach to healing that operates independently of invocation. The absence of Anunnaki names in these medical instructions mirrors patterns seen elsewhere in administration, law, and measurement. Their prior association with order and authority is no longer needed to justify action. Practical knowledge continues through structured practice rather than through appeal to the divine. The tablets function as manuals of inherited expertise. In a few cases, the language does retain vestiges of ritual, such as a note suggesting washing hands or performing a symbolic gesture. Even so, these acts are rarely tied to broader cosmology. They are procedural markers, steps within a sequence rather than narrative claims about celestial oversight. Their inclusion appears to reinforce technique rather than to call on authority. The stability of this knowledge implies a careful system of transmission. Apprentices would learn by copying tablets and observing practice, internalizing methods that had been refined over decades. The continuity of results depended on fidelity to procedure rather than on the memory of divine intervention. Knowledge, in this sense, outlives its originators. This raises a subtle reflection on the nature of preservation. When healing relies on repeated, reliable practice, and when the authority of tradition is embedded in procedure rather than narrative, how much of what was once understood as sacred or divinely sanctioned is carried forward purely as inherited efficacy? And if the act of treatment is maintained without invocation, does the knowledge itself silently assert its own authority? If knowledge could persist in practice, in calculation, and in healing, it could still depend on a medium that preserves form without asserting understanding. In the later Sumerian archives, this condition becomes evident. Temple and palace repositories contain shelves of tablets, each copied with meticulous care, yet often without annotation or commentary. The texts are preserved as they were, their instructions intact, but the rationale for their origin is rarely recorded. These archives reveal an extraordinary attention to fidelity. Scribes carefully reproduce signs, sequences, and numbers, ensuring that a tablet copied in Uruk mirrors one from Nippur decades earlier. Administrative records, legal documents, mathematical tables, and medical recipes all demonstrate this continuity. The physical act of copying becomes the instrument of preservation, a means of extending memory beyond any single practitioner's lifetime. What is notable is the absence of exegesis. Few tablets explain why a particular ritual is performed, why a sequence of measurements is arranged as it is, or why certain prescriptions accompany given symptoms. In some cases, scribes include marginal corrections, but these corrections focus on accuracy of replication rather than interpretation. The archive records practice, not reflection. This approach allows inherited knowledge to survive, even if understanding fades. A temple scribe in Lagash may copy a star list originally composed for cosmological purposes hundreds of years earlier. The names, the order, the calculations remain intact, yet the meaning behind their arrangement is not elaborated. Similarly, a legal tablet may be reproduced exactly, though the reasoning behind a particular precedent is no longer cited. Preservation becomes procedural. The archives themselves seem organized with an awareness of their own function. Tablets are sorted by type: astronomical observations in one room, administrative ledgers in another, medical texts in yet another. Within these groupings, copying appears systematic, with older texts replicated to maintain consistency. The collection is a repository not only of knowledge but of form, the accumulated shape of prior records. This meticulous replication implies a form of trust. Scribes, temple administrators, and palace officials depend on the texts as authorities in themselves. If a measurement, a treatment, or a transaction is preserved correctly, its application can proceed without requiring understanding of why it was first conceived. The emphasis shifts from interpretation to fidelity. Even when tablets record phenomena tied to the Anunnaki or earlier sacred frameworks, their later copies may omit invocation or explanatory commentary. The god's presence is often reduced to the original phrasing, treated as a fixed element of the text rather than an active principle guiding the action. Memory is maintained through replication, not through reasoning. The pattern extends beyond content to the very act of writing. Scribes are trained to recognize and reproduce signs exactly. Their skill ensures continuity, yet it does not necessarily convey comprehension of original context. The archives operate as instruments of cultural memory, preserving sequences, calculations, and prescriptions as forms that can be enacted even if the circumstances that produced them are forgotten. This separation of form from explanation introduces a quiet tension. Knowledge is maintained, yet its rationale becomes increasingly opaque. The copying of texts ensures that procedures, numbers, and sequences survive, but whether the cultural and historical significance remains accessible is uncertain. The archive remembers, but understanding may not follow. The cumulative effect is a civilization that continues through structured memory. Administrative systems function, astronomical observations are recorded, laws are applied, and medical practices are enacted, all according to inherited procedure. Authority resides less in reinterpretation than in the trust placed in faithful preservation. Yet the very reliability of the archive raises a question. If texts can be preserved perfectly, and practices can be executed according to inherited form, what is lost when understanding is no longer explicitly recorded? When the silent repetition of signs carries forward the memory of earlier knowledge, how does the civilization interpret the meaning that no longer accompanies the method? Even as administrative, mathematical, and medical texts continue with remarkable consistency, the mythological tablets present a contrasting pattern. Many of these stories, once elaborate and carefully framed with divine presence, now appear in fragments. Tales that begin with the familiar names of gods or cosmic events often halt abruptly, leaving narrative threads unresolved. The break in continuity is striking, suggesting a moment when the preservation of form no longer extended to the preservation of meaning. In the excavated libraries of Nippur and tablets bearing the remains of mythic cycles reveal the phenomenon. One fragment may recount the deeds of a divine assembly, detailing creation or judgment, only to end mid-episode. A second tablet, often missing or never completed, might have provided the resolution. The scribe faithfully copied what existed before them, yet the narrative itself is truncated. In some cases, parallel copies show similar omissions, implying that the loss is not a matter of individual error but of wider transmission. The abrupt ending of these texts contrasts sharply with the precision observed in practical tablets. Whereas a grain ledger or a legal code can be preserved in entirety through replication, myths seem more vulnerable to interruption. There is little evidence that scribes attempted to reconstruct or complete the stories. Their role appears to have been to maintain the tablet as they received it, even if its content was partial or obsolete. This raises the question of why mythic continuity was not prioritized. Some fragments suggest that earlier traditions still held prestige. The gods are named, cosmic events referenced, and ritual contexts hinted at. Yet the absence of concluding sections or explanatory notes implies a change in perceived relevance. Perhaps the stories were treated as historical memory rather than living guidance, their completion no longer necessary for contemporary practice. Certain tablets provide hints of editorial activity. Signs of erasure or over-inscription appear where text may have been altered or shortened. In some cases, a line is replaced with a brief notation, possibly reflecting the scribe's judgment about what was essential. Such interventions suggest that the silence may result not only from accidental loss, but from conscious choice, a recalibration of what the record needed to preserve. The phenomenon also aligns with patterns observed in administrative and technical records. Knowledge that serves immediate function is meticulously maintained. Knowledge framed as heritage or narrative is subject to attrition. Myth becomes a secondary layer, preserved when convenient, abbreviated when redundant. The gods themselves, once active agents of cosmic order, appear only as names or brief attributions in these later fragments. Even when fragments hint at previously detailed episodes, the text often offers no interpretation. A storm that might once have been described as divine punishment is now noted merely as an event. Characters act, yet their motivations and resolutions are largely absent. The scribe's role is to reproduce what exists, not to elaborate on what has been lost or forgotten. Preservation prioritizes form over meaning. The abruptness of these texts may also reflect a transition in societal focus. When law, administration, measurement, and medicine continue with procedural fidelity, the function of myth may be reevaluated. Narrative authority yields to operational authority. Stories that once encoded moral or cosmic order are no longer required to guide action directly. Their fragments survive as echoes rather than instructions. Yet these broken myths retain subtle traces of their original context. Names, settings, and episodes preserve the shape of prior imagination. They imply continuity, even as the narrative is suspended. The reader or practitioner is left to recognize patterns and gaps without explicit guidance, engaging with memory in a form that is partial, inherited, and increasingly silent. This leads to a quiet uncertainty. If mythic narratives are transmitted only in fragments, and if the reasons for their omission or abbreviation are not recorded, can we ever determine whether the silence represents loss, deliberate choice, or the natural evolution of relevance? And in the absence of completion, how does a civilization interpret its own inherited memory when the stories that once framed its cosmos no longer speak in full? Beyond the borders of Mesopotamia, the archaeological record hints at similar patterns of interruption and quietude. In Egypt, for instance, periods emerge in which monumental inscriptions, royal lists, and narrative texts diminish or alter in character. The transition between the Old Kingdom and the First Intermediate Period shows reduced elaboration in inscriptions. Pyramids and tombs continue to be constructed, yet the accompanying textual record shifts in tone and detail. Names of rulers persist, but the elaborate divine associations that marked earlier compositions are noticeably restrained. The forms of administration, craft, and ritual endure, yet the language that once intertwined cosmic order with kingship becomes markedly sparser. In the Indus region, the evidence takes a different form, yet echoes the theme of procedural continuity without mythic elaboration. Seals, weights, and urban layouts remain precise, attesting to complex systems of trade, measurement, and administration. Yet inscriptions on the small corpus of signs remain limited and enigmatic, offering little in the way of narrative context or overt invocation. The functions of the signs appear technical, indicating authority, ownership, or standardization, rather than recounting stories or cosmologies. Knowledge is enacted and maintained, yet its explanatory framework is largely absent. The juxtaposition of these regions with Mesopotamia invites reflection on the nature of transitional silences. In all cases, practical systems, administration, architecture, measurement, and ritual procedure persist with remarkable fidelity, while narrative and cosmological elaboration diminishes. The preservation of structure contrasts with the attenuation of explanation, suggesting that the mechanisms of civilization can continue even when the rationale behind them is no longer fully articulated. Material evidence underscores these parallels. In Egypt, the shift in writing from the elaborate hieroglyphic inscriptions of the Old Kingdom to the more abbreviated forms of the First Intermediate Period coincides with political decentralization. Similarly, in the Indus region, the standardization of weights and measures appears to outlive the full interpretive record of the signs themselves. In Mesopotamia, the archival tablets preserve procedures, calculations, and administrative sequences, even as mythic and divine references fade. In each case, the transmission of practical knowledge appears independent of full comprehension or narrative justification. Yet these silences are not absolute. Traces of continuity remain embedded within the surviving forms. Temple and palace construction in Egypt continues along established patterns. Urban planning in Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro maintains a remarkable regularity. In Mesopotamia, scribal schools persist, copying texts with care. The mechanics of civilization, its techniques, sequences, and procedures, are conserved even when the surrounding cosmology is muted. Form endures, and function is preserved, but the broader cultural commentary is often abbreviated or absent. The phenomenon also raises questions about cultural priorities. In each region, the preservation of administration and technique implies that practical knowledge was valued above narrative continuity during periods of transition. The fidelity of procedure may have been sufficient to maintain social cohesion, economic stability, and ritual observance, even when mythic elaboration was no longer transmitted with equal attention. The silent intervals in textual and narrative records suggest a civilization attentive to inheritance in operational terms, rather than in symbolic or explanatory terms. Archaeological observation supports this distinction. Excavated libraries, administrative archives, and urban layouts indicate careful maintenance of systems, while narrative texts become fragmentary or entirely absent. The structures themselves, temples, granaries, and civic complexes, signal continuity of function. The material world is preserved in parallel with practical memory, whereas the accompanying mythic or explanatory record is intermittent. These parallels suggest that silence is not necessarily indicative of societal collapse or abrupt discontinuity. Instead, it may reflect an adaptation in which the conservation of operational knowledge takes precedence over the transmission of narrative or mythic content. The method, rather than the story, is retained. Across multiple regions, a pattern emerges in which civilization safeguards the tools of administration, measurement, and practice, even when the rationale, cosmology, or sacred justification is reduced. Still, questions linger. If Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus region each display this selective preservation, what does it reveal about the mechanisms of cultural memory? How does a society maintain continuity in function when the stories that once framed understanding are no longer fully conveyed? And in the spaces left by these silences, what forms of knowledge are preserved purely through inherited practice, awaiting the attentive eye of future scribes and administrators? The pattern of continuity amid silence raises the possibility that the Sumerians themselves regarded memory as a matter of selective preservation. Within temple archives and palace libraries, the meticulous recording of transactions, measurements, and procedures suggests a conscious decision to maintain functional knowledge. Tablets detailing grain distributions, labor assignments, or water management remain complete and precise, while mythic elaboration and divine attribution diminish. This contrast implies that what was remembered and transmitted was determined not only by circumstance, but by administrative priorities. Scribes trained in careful copying and standardized notation appear to have followed established protocols that emphasized accuracy above interpretation. In replicating older records, they ensured that the operational backbone of society, its calculations, inventories, and instructions, remained intact. Meanwhile, stories, cosmologies, and narrative accounts were reproduced only when directly tied to practice, and even then often in truncated form. The preservation of function over story may have reflected a broader bureaucratic philosophy. Memory was useful when it facilitated governance, production, or ritual procedure, but unnecessary when it existed purely for narrative or symbolic purposes. The physical arrangement of archives reinforces this notion. Tablets are organized by type and purpose, rather than by thematic or mythic content. Administrative rooms contain ledgers and accounting texts. Temple repositories store procedural instructions for offerings and ritual tasks. Mythic texts are occasionally present, yet they occupy marginal positions within the collections and are more likely to appear in fragmentary copies. The spatial distribution suggests a hierarchy of value in recording. Operational knowledge commanded attention, while narrative elaboration was maintained only insofar as it intersected with practical concerns. Even the act of copying itself reflects selective focus. Scribal colophons frequently note the scribe's fidelity to the original, emphasizing correctness in signs, numbers, and quantities. Such statements rarely comment on the meaning of the content. A scribe may stress that a grain allocation is recorded exactly as the previous tablet indicates, but the rationale for the system, or the origin of the authority behind it, remains unexamined. In this context, memory becomes a tool of administration. Precise replication ensures continuity, and the relevance of the record derives from its operational utility rather than its explanatory depth. This bureaucratic minimalism appears across multiple domains. Mathematical tables are preserved with absolute consistency, even when the cosmological explanations they may have once embodied are absent. Medical texts provide procedural guidance without invocation, and legal codes increasingly rely on precedent rather than divine sanction. In each instance, the texts perform the function they were intended to perform, while the interpretive or narrative layers that may have originally accompanied them are left to fade. Silence, therefore, may reflect an intentional narrowing of focus, a decision to record what is essential for continuity while allowing other aspects of culture to recede. The pattern extends to the treatment of temples and sacred spaces. While sites are rebuilt on older foundations and offerings continue, dedicatory inscriptions gradually evolve or shorten, emphasizing ritual procedure rather than mythic genealogy. In this way, religious practice is maintained through prescribed action, even as the accompanying cosmological explanation diminishes. The administration of devotion becomes procedural, and memory is enacted rather than narrated. Considering this, the Silent Age can be viewed less as a period of loss and more as a period of strategic retention. Knowledge is transmitted selectively, with practical application as the guiding principle. Myths, divine genealogies, and cosmological narratives are retained only insofar as they support operational continuity. The choices made by scribes and administrators, consciously or institutionally, shape what survives and what fades. Preservation is therefore a matter of administrative judgment, as much as it is of historical accident. Yet this approach raises a subtle question. If the mechanisms of civilization continue to operate while the explanatory frameworks recede, how does a society interpret its own inherited memory when the stories that once framed understanding are no longer fully preserved? Does the narrowing of record create a silent culture of function, or does it invite future generations to reconstruct meaning from forms whose original context has quietly vanished? Even as the Silent Age becomes more apparent in the tablets, the absence of certain arguments is as revealing as the presences themselves. The texts of post-flood Mesopotamia are careful, precise, and remarkably consistent in their recording of administrative, ritual, and practical knowledge. They maintain grain allocations, labor schedules, and temple offerings with fidelity, yet they rarely comment on the vanished mythic figures whose names once populated earlier inscriptions. In these omissions, there is no outright denial of the Anunnaki or their deeds. The records do not challenge what came before, nor do they attempt to revise earlier genealogies. They simply carry forward without them. This restraint suggests a considered approach to memory. Scribes, who were trained to copy and preserve, might have regarded the previous generations of divine names as contextually distant, unnecessary for the functioning of the day-to-day administration. The absence of mythic debate is not equivalent to rejection. It is a choice to prioritize operational continuity over cosmological commentary. Legal codes continue, detailing obligations and punishments, without invoking the sanction of gods previously central to legitimization. Temple inventories persist, specifying offerings and procedures, yet the accompanying explanatory narratives are truncated or omitted. In effect, what is unrecorded is treated as functionally irrelevant rather than false. The language of the tablets reinforces this impression. Words once used to assert divine favor or descent gradually recede from the texts, replaced by terms emphasizing measurement, quantity, and sequence. Mathematical, administrative, and calendrical tablets retain meticulous notation. The care with which scribes reproduce these records suggests that preservation was paramount. Embellishment or speculation was unnecessary. The memory preserved is procedural, not argumentative, and this procedural focus creates a kind of quiet neutrality regarding the earlier divine framework. There is no evidence of polemic or refutation, only the steady maintenance of inherited practice. Archaeological evidence further supports this interpretation. Temples rebuilt on older foundations retain structural continuity, while dedicatory inscriptions evolve in style and content. Rituals continue according to established form, yet cosmological justification is gradually minimized. Similarly, palace archives maintain bureaucratic precision without comment on mythic precedent. The silence in the record is therefore selective. Certain elements of memory are sustained, others are omitted, but the omission itself does not constitute a judgment. It is an administrative decision as much as a historical reality. This careful omission may indicate that the Anunnaki, if once central to social and religious thought, had become less necessary to record in operational terms. Their presence in memory may have been absorbed into the procedural routines themselves. Offerings are still made, fields still irrigated, disputes still adjudicated according to codified law, yet the rationale that once depended on mythic authority is replaced by functional necessity. The texts do not seek to reinterpret or dispute earlier accounts, they simply proceed without elaboration. In this way, absence becomes a mode of preservation. The continuity of function is maintained while narrative context recedes. It is also notable that the silence is uneven. Certain temple archives retain fragmentary mythological lists or genealogies, suggesting that scribes were capable of transmitting these texts if they deemed them relevant. The fact that many post-flood records omit such references implies intentionality. The administrative gaze was trained on what sustained society, rather than on reasserting the cosmic hierarchy of the past. In this sense, the records speak through omission as much as through content. Memory is preserved in the measured acts of record-keeping rather than in interpretive commentary. Yet the very gaps in the record leave room for uncertainty. The Anunnaki are neither denounced nor fully recalled. They inhabit a liminal space in the post-flood memory. The texts allow for multiple possibilities: that the Anunnaki were forgotten with the passage of time, that their roles were integrated into procedural norms, or that they simply ceased to require mention because their authority was assumed rather than articulated. The silence of the tablets does not resolve the question of presence or absence. It preserves it as a quiet ambiguity, a space left deliberately unargued. In considering what the Sumerian records do not argue against, the investigation of the Silent Age comes to a subtle conclusion. The tablets, archives, and inscriptions of this period preserve civilization in operation, ensuring continuity of measurement, law, ritual, and administration, while leaving the earlier mythic framework largely unspoken. They demonstrate that memory can be selective, that inheritance can prioritize function over explanation, and that the absence of commentary is itself meaningful. Through this quiet approach, the scribes and administrators transmit not only what they record, but also the unspoken choices of what is left unrecorded. And so, as we observe the Silent Age in these enduring texts, one final question emerges, hovering at the edge of the preserved record. In leaving the Anunnaki unmentioned, did the Sumerians of the post-flood era consciously absorb their presence into the mechanisms of daily life? Or did time and practice render them unnecessary to memory at all, leaving a civilization that continues flawlessly while the origins of its authority quietly recede? So here we are, at the end of our journey through millennia. We've traced the arc from the mythological beginnings described in the Sumerian king list through the transitional Silent Age, and into the fully historical period where myth and history coexist in sophisticated synthesis. We've examined the actual texts, the king list, the royal inscriptions, the myths, the administrative documents, and let them speak for themselves rather than imposing modern fantasies upon them. We've walked through the archaeological evidence from Eridu to Ur, from Nippur to Lagash, seeing how the physical remains align with and illuminate the textual record. We've confronted the misinformation spread by Sitchin and his followers, explaining precisely why their translations are wrong and their interpretations unfounded. But most importantly, we've discovered what the Sumerian records actually reveal: the birth of historical consciousness itself, humanity's first successful integration of mythological tradition with empirical observation, the foundation of the worldview that made civilization possible. The Silent Age isn't a mystery to be sensationalized or a gap to be filled with speculation. It's a transformation to be understood and appreciated, the maturation of human consciousness from purely mythological to historically grounded, from understanding divine action as constant miraculous intervention to recognizing divine order expressed through natural and institutional patterns. The Anunnaki didn't leave because they were never here as physical beings. They remained present in Mesopotamian theology for millennia because they represented something real and important: the divine council, the cosmic order, the powers that structure reality. Understanding them as gods rather than aliens doesn't diminish their significance. It illuminates the sophisticated theological thought of the world's first urban civilization. I want to emphasize something crucial: approaching these texts with scholarly rigor, reading them in their original contexts, distinguishing between myth and history. None of this makes them less valuable or less fascinating. In fact, it makes them more so. The real Sumerians were remarkable. Their achievements, inventing writing, developing mathematics, building cities, creating literature, establishing law, recording history. These are genuinely awe-inspiring accomplishments achieved through human ingenuity, creativity, and persistence across generations. We don't need to attribute these achievements to aliens to make them impressive. The truth is more impressive than the fiction. And we don't need to invent mysteries and conspiracies to make the ancient world interesting. The real story of how human civilization developed, how consciousness evolved, how we learned to think historically and scientifically while maintaining mythological and religious worldviews. That story is endlessly fascinating and genuinely important for understanding who we are and how we got here. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. If you found value in this deep dive into authentic Sumerian history and thought, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. What aspect of this story fascinated you most? The textual evidence, the archaeological discoveries, the debunking of ancient astronaut theories, or the deeper implications about the development of consciousness and civilization? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, the ancient world is endlessly rich with real mysteries, genuine achievements, and profound insights. We just need to approach it with curiosity, critical thinking, and respect for what the evidence actually shows rather than what we might want it to show. Until next time, may your path through history's deepest mysteries be illuminated by curiosity, guided by critical thinking, and enriched by authentic wonder at the real achievements of our ancient ancestors who laid the foundations of the world we now inhabit.